just wanna talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books. Talk about some, talk about some, talk about some books. Talk about some, talk about some, talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books with you.
Hey everybody, I'm Jo,
And I'm JoJo, and this is Canonical Nonsense.
and we are just two cups of Joe reading books.
Today we are going to talk about Eragon by Christopher Paolini.
So, some background around Eragon. It was Paolini's first book, which he famously started writing when he was 15. He did get it published when he was 19. It was first self published by his family, and then a year later it was picked up by Knopf. I remember people were praising him as a genius. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I think we both read it around the same time. It took me a full year of picking this book up and putting it down to finish it, but I think we both read it around middle school and we were like, "Wow, such a good book written by such a young person. He must be a genius."
Yeah, but even adults were saying that this man was a genius, or boy, I guess. Well, he was a man when it was traditionally published. I think that we have a few things to say about that, but that's okay. I mean, I think it's an impressive feat for someone so young to publish a book like this, but genius might be strong of a word.
I also think that in 2020 and that recently people have looked back on this book and been like, "Oh, you could tell he was 17 when he was writing this."
Yeah, it feels like something a 17-year-old would write. I think also with the advent and the popularization of fan fiction and the absolutely prolific fanfic writers on those websites, most of which or not most of which, but many of which are just teenagers. And it's kind of impressive the volume that they're putting out. And I know it's fan fiction, but this is basically Lord of the Rings fan fiction, if we're being honest. I kind of am like, does this kind of dull the kind of wow factor around this book because so many people are putting out so much content at such young ages?
Yeah, and a thing I learned from my sister, who is much more in touch with the fan fiction sphere than I am, is that there is original character fan fiction. So this would fall very neatly into that category, which is interesting.
Could you explain that?
It's just fan fiction that includes original characters and stories, and I was like, "Isn't that just stories?" And my sister was like, "Yep, but it's on our fan fiction website." So, I think,
Huh.
as we all know, that the line between what is fan fiction and what is just regular fiction is, very thin line that sort of just exists because of US copyright laws, but
Yeah.
also, writing is writing. There's no real difference between the 2, just the way that society decides to interact with it.
Yeah, there is also a huge movement happening right now, and a lot of people are complaining about it. I'm not really a part. I have read a few of the books that I didn't know were fan fiction, or I didn't know the source because I hadn't seen the source of the fan fiction. That they write them originally as fan fiction and then they just change the names and kind of change. It's like a AU, like an alternate reality, and they're getting traditionally published and really promoted heavily, and there's some backlash right now. I'm not really knowledgeable about that conversation that's happening, but I kind of feel like if Aragon was published today it would be a part of that conversation, and it's just because it was published so many years ago now. It was published in 2002 that it kind of was able to escape that conversation that's happening. But anyway, Aragon is part of the Inheritance Cycle, which is 5 books currently. And then it has 2 smaller volumes, one of which is a collection of short stories, and the other is a guidebook for new writers. So probably some of you have read all of those, and that's great. But we're going to talk about just Aragon today.
Before we get too deep into this, we just want to let everyone know this is maybe not the nicest. This is probably the meanest we're
Wait. Let's back up, back up. Before we get into this episode, we just want to say that we did have a hard time with this book. Just because we did not like this book doesn't mean that you have to dislike this book. If you really like Aragon, if it's a really important book to you, that's really wonderful. And that just because we disagree doesn't mean that your opinion is bad. It doesn't mean that our opinion is bad. It just means that we have different opinions. So I'm happy for anyone who really loves the Inheritance Cycle and who really loves Aragon. That's great. we just didn't have the same feelings surrounding this character. So just take that with a grain of salt before you listen to this episode.
Yeah, yeah. We've been reading a bunch of bad books, so we're just a little grumpy about it.
With that being said, as always, this is a spoiler podcast. So if you haven't read Eragon and you don't want it to be spoiled for you, I would suggest going to go read it and then come back and listen to us later.
I do have to say, if you want to just listen to this podcast and have us tell you what happens, it's not that different from reading the book.
We might save you some time. if All right, so there aren't really that many trigger warnings because this is a book for children, but we have character death. Obviously there's probably going to be character death in an epic fantasy. There are references to torture. A few of the characters get tortured. And then there is a very, very, very subtle reference to attempted sexual assault that was attempted off screen. But blink and you'll miss it. All of these are super, super mild. All right. Do you want to talk about recommending the book first? Or do you want to just...
I think if you are reading a book to a child and you're reading it over the course of many nights, because this is like a bedtime book, Eragon's a pretty good book to do because the chapters are relatively short, so you could read one or two of them. Each chapter kind of has its own thing going on. There's just like so much stuff in this book that keeps happening that you could like kind of plot through it, but like none of it's necessarily connected to each other, so you could fall asleep to it. I think there's a utility for this book, but I didn't super enjoy it. I started out enjoying it because it was like kind of poppy, but it really drags in the middle, and then it just sort of is like, oh no, a climax.
Yeah, I mean, this book was written by a child the audience is children, and we are not children. So I kind of think that a child would probably really enjoy this book, but I agree with you.
Yeah.
I do want to mention, so when I was in my dragon phase as a child, I read this book, and after reading this book, I remember really trying to find books that centered female main characters who were working with dragons instead of male characters. And I didn't remember why, other than the fact that like I am a woman and I wanted to see myself represented in these characters and in these books. And after reading this book again, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I know why. I was begging for some women in these books and not just men who look at women. So that was interesting to me to realize because I actually didn't remember anything in this book.
I remembered absolutely nothing about this book too. You want to dive in?
Yeah, let's dive in. All right. Oh, before I begin, I just want to say that this book relies extremely heavily on tropes, and it follows the hero's journey pretty much to a T. So if you're unfamiliar with the hero's journey, it is I'm not going to go through all of the 17 steps, but it's called a monomyth, and it was popularized by Joseph Campbell in his book Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he talks about basically these steps that happen in a lot of these stories that go all the way back to our earliest storytelling traditions, all the way around the world. They seem unaffected by space and time. It's just something that exists in stories. So we have the same story beats in Gilgamesh that we do in the Odyssey, and this story really, really follows them. When I was kind of looking online, I did find that there's this huge dialogue surrounding whether or not he just ripped off Star Wars or he was following the hero's journey. And I think it's a little bit of both because Star Wars was heavily influenced by the hero's journey. George Lucas really liked Joseph Campbell. He also really liked Carl Jung and his archetypes. So he intentionally and purposefully had A New Hope follow the hero's journey and, the first Star Wars trilogy that came out. And I do also think that Eragon kind of rips off Star Wars because you can have two stories follow the hero's journey and not feel exactly the same. I don't think that we would read the Odyssey and feel like, oh, this is just Star Wars, even though we might see some plot in the story beats happen. We wouldn't think like, oh, this scene is exactly like in Star Wars. But in this book, there were a few scenes where I was like, this is exactly like the scene in A New Hope.
You know, there's that old phrase that like good writers steal, and I do believe in that, but because a lot of the characterization is like very flimsy and things are kind of taken whole cloth, it makes it
Mhm.
more obvious than in other stories that are use the same like structure.
Yeah, and I think we are going to get into that when we talk about the magic system. And so, all right, the book begins with a shade laying a trap for a group of elves. And a shade is like a evil being that is, I don't, do you want to explain what a shade is?
It's sort of unclear in the book. There's like two different types of servers of the Dark Lord that like kind of blurred together, but from what I got is it's do you want me to talk about how it's like a dude who like lets spirits into his body, or do you just want to be like it's a skull guy who can do magic and like carries a sword?
I mean, I think you explained it. They let spirits into their bodies is like how they actually work. They function really similarly to the way that fades function in A Wheel of Time, and fade and shade are basically the same sounding word. And this scene is really similar to a scene in the first Wheel of Time book. So it feels like it was just directly lifted. Anyway, the shade is laying a trap for a group of elves. He is controlling a group of Urgles, which are basically orcs, but you might also think, those seem like Trollocs, because the Fades can control Trollocs in A Wheel of Time. Now, Trollocs are based off of orcs, and Robert Jordan didn't try to hide that, but this just really feels like a scene in A Wheel of Time.
It's just like several layers of canon like smushed on top of each other, you know, like a layer cake, and then you just take the whole cake out and put it in your novel.
Yeah. So they kill two of the elves, but the third elf does escape, or she's trying to escape, and then she holds a giant stone in her hand, and phew, it disappears. But the shade then hits her with a bolt of magical fire, and she passes out. I don't think the Fades in the Wheel of Time use magic in the same way, so it's a little different, but he is the same character as the Fades in the first Wheel of Time book, so he fulfills the same role. And then he takes her with him and leaves. So that was the introduction. Meanwhile, Eragon is out hunting when a sudden explosion scares away all of the deer, and in the center of this crash site, there's a polished stone. It's described as being about a foot long, blue, with white veins. And Eragon's like, maybe I can sell this for some meat. So he takes it with him. Do you want to describe what Eragon looks like?
Oh, isn't he just like kind of a scrawny little boy with like dark brown hair?
Yeah, he is described exactly the same as the picture of Christopher Paolini in the dust jacket of this book.
Who's to say what's going on there? Yeah, he's just like a 15-year-old boy. He spends a lot of time thinking about meat and thinking about how good he is at tracking. He's so Aragon thinking about how good he is at things or other people telling him how good he is at things like starts pretty early and continues throughout the book where like we are told that the spine is like such a dangerous place that even the evil lord doesn't dare send troops into it. And then Aragon's like, but I'm better and I can just wander around it. So he's like hunting in the spine, which is like one of the few free places in the world. That's where he finds the rock, and that's the start of the book.
Humble brags. He's like, I don't know, misfortune never befell me here, but it's not through like any skill or anything. I guess I'm just lucky. It's like, oh my god. Okay. Yeah, so as Jojo said, Galbatorix is the emperor of the empire, which does the empire have a name? Maybe. Alleglesia or something. But that's a country, that's not the empire.
Yeah, I think the Empire is just the area that he holds, and then Alleglesia is like I was a little confused about borders in this book, and I wasn't sure if it was
Was
because
too.
yeah.
Yeah. I was too. I was actually really confused every time he tried to describe any scenery or building or, anything really. I kind of felt like it wasn't described in a way that I could really visualize it.
I thought he was good with nature. Like anytime we went to like a different climate, I was like, got it. This is brushlands. This is forest. This is desert. But buildings, I was like, no clue.
Yeah, there's a scene later on that I'm gonna ask you what you think this thing is
Oh,
because I couldn't figure it out. And I didn't look it up. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. So Aragon returns home. He lives outside of town, but the town that he lives close to is Carvajal. And he goes to a butcher named Sloane to buy unspecified meat. He just wants some meat, any meat. It's not described. He doesn't ask for a specific kind of meat. He's like, I want some meat. And Sloane, the butcher, doesn't want to sell it to him because he doesn't have any money. And he's portrayed as this bad guy, but like, he doesn't have any money. Why would he sell it to him? Anyway, Aragon tries to barter with the stone, and Sloane initially is like, fine, I'll give you 3 crowns for it. But then he learns that it's from the spine, and Sloane's wife died in the spine, so he thinks it's cursed, which everyone also thinks it's cursed. It's not just Sloane. So he's like, no, you are not giving me that stone. While they're talking back and forth, and Sloane is being portrayed as this evil, evil man, Horst, who is the town blacksmith, comes in and is like, well, I'll buy the meat for Aragon. And he tells him that, well, you can just work it off in my forge later to pay me back. So he completely fills Aragon's pack with this meat, various cuts of meat. The finest cuts of meat, I think, is what Horst buys. And then Aragon goes home. We learn that Aragon is living with his uncle and his cousin. His uncle's name is Garrow, and his cousin's name is Roran. His mother came to Carvajal when she was pregnant with Aragon, gave birth to him, and then left soon after. He did used to have an aunt, but she died before this book starts. So it's just him and Garrow and Roran.
By the way, if you're like, does this happen in a scene naturally? No. At the beginning of a chapter, Aragon wakes up and is like, man, this is the day my mom left. Anyway, here's my tragic backstory. And I was like, boy. And then I was like, you know what? Get it over quickly. I don't want to be wondering what your tragic backstory is for the whole book. And then I was like, well, at least that's what they're going to do. And listeners, that's not what they're going to do. They're going to be some tragic backstories that we're going to have to wait the whole book to hear, and they're not worth it.
The only way that this would have been more unbearable is if this book was written in the first person. Because it's written in the third person, I'm kind of like, okay, I can handle it. But if it was like, let me tell you about me, Eragon, I would have lost my mind. So anyway, a few days later, traders come to the village, and Eragon and his uncle go into town to try to sell the stone to them, but no one wants to buy it. They're like, I don't know what this is worth, or they're like, I don't really want to mess with this thing. So they're not able to sell it. But while they're in town, they watch the troubadour show. So the troubadours perform, and then Brom, who's the town's storyteller, tells a story about the ancient dragon riders and how the king rose to power after his dragon was killed, and he went mad with grief. Do you want to tell this story?
Kind of a dumb story. I mean, there's a lot of like dragon tropes that you learn sort of for the first time. So you have this like specialist boy who's a rider, who, spoiler alert, is the evil emperor, who is so good at everything but gets a little cocky. And then his dragon dies, and he's like trapped in this inhospitable place. And he's just like, oh, I'm so sad that my dragon died. I'm going to make it everybody else's problem. So eventually gets out and then tricks people because he's the specialist boy at manipulating people's brains. And then he eventually converts one rider whose name escapes me.
Morzan,
thank you. To like join his group. And then he gets a new dragon, which is
a black dragon because he's evil now.
Yeah. But it's also sort of like interesting because so much about all of these like Dragon Rider stories, especially the Dragon Riders that Pern stuff, you get one dragon, and if you fuck it up, then you're traumatized forever. But in this one, it's like, now he goes and gets a second dragon, and it's way cooler, and then he convinces other people to join his side and eventually destroys the Dragon Riders, which were the ruling class in this world.
He smashes all the eggs, and he duels his master, who's like the strongest leader of the Dragon Riders, and kills him. And it really, really, really sounds like Star Wars with Anakin and Obi-Wan.
Yeah, didn't this come out though before those movies? I can't remember the timeline.
Yeah, I asked a few friends who know the Star Wars lore, and they said that the lore was known. Now, if you're listening to this and you're like, actually, the lore wasn't known, that's okay. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But if he was able to just like take a shot and make it exactly like Anakin's fall from fall from goodness to evilness on the dark side. Damn, Paolini, good job with that. But
Kudos.
you have to remember that like there were dozens and dozens of Star Wars books that had all the Star Wars lore in them at that time.
This is not a Star Wars podcast. I haven't even seen all the movies, so
You haven't? I just rewatched the first trilogy and then I watched the first in the prequel trilogy. But anyway, it just sounds it's like so similar that you're like, oh, where have I seen this before? Whether or not he took it from that story, who knows?
anyway, back to so Galbatorix destroys all the dragons. He's the only one with dragons, and then he basically conquers the lands that the dragon riders had already were ruling.
Yeah, he has 13 Forsworn. There are 13 dragon riders that join him because they're like, yes, I want power too, because the dark side's all about, power. And they help him conquer the continent.
Yeah, it's unclear what the leadership of the continent was before, because usually in dragon rider books, the dragon riders aren't nobility, they're just kind of cops. So it's curious.
Yeah, it is unclear. It kind of feels like they are just cops though. Like he kind of, because when Murta is like explaining what Galbatorix says to him later in the book, he's like, he painted me a vision where we had shining cities all over the empire and the dragon riders were keeping the peace throughout them. So it kind of sounds like they were cops. Paolini does say that he was heavily influenced by Pern, and it does show.
Yeah.
He also, Galbatorix, kept 3 dragon eggs that he is trying to get to hatch. And the way that dragon eggs work, we learned this a little later, but I think it's fine if I explain it now. They are laid ready to hatch, and they wait until the right circumstances arise until they hatch. So wild dragons that aren't going to be bonded with a rider wait for good weather, I guess, and food conditions. But the dragon eggs that the dragons give to the Order of the Riders to become bonded, they are waiting for the right person to touch the egg. And when the person that they want to bond with touches the egg, then they hatch. So it's kind of different from Pern, but not it's similar but different than Pern in a few ways.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about dragons where there theoretically are regular dragons that aren't talking to people or don't want anything to do with people, that are more like regular smart lizards.
Where are all of them?
They talk about them in the book and we never see them. So that's a thing. And then there are these dragon riders, which is like there's a lot of like soulmate vibes in this book.
Yeah, fated mate kind of stuff.
And the dragon rider bond is like that, where
It
like
does seem like if the baby dragon is like, I'm an evil baby dragon, they will bond to an evil person. So you can't trust that just because they chose a person, that person is going to be good. So like the second dragon that Galbatorix picked, I guess, was like an evil baby dragon.
yeah. Anyway, so that's them going to town and hearing Braun talk about dragons and stuff. And like it's kind of supposed to be secret lore,
Yeah,
but
they're like, oh, he's never told that story before. You'll never hear that story again because the king or the emperor will get so angry if he realizes that he told it.
well, but also like everybody else just knows the story later in the book, so it's unclear. It's just a weird addition to that thing. Actually liked this scene. I thought all of the scenes in his hometown were like kind of cute and like very wholesome.
Enjoying it until they leave.
The writing is also better here.
Yeah.
The first chunk of the book is the best part of the book, I would say.
The first part of books is usually the most polished. I think that he really just struggled to write traveling scenes, which is most of the book.
I just think the pacing is like wild, but anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, he gets home that night. The stone hatches because it's actually a dragon egg. Who guessed it? And a baby dragon pops out, and she's really cute. She's like a little. I actually like. The dragon was no longer than his forearm, yet it was dignified and noble. Its scales were a deep sapphire blue, the same color as the stone. The dragon fanned its wings. They were what had made it appear so contorted. The wings were several times longer than its body and ribbed with thin fingers of bone that extended from the wing's front edge, forming a line of widely spaced talons. The dragon's head was roughly triangular. Two diminutive white fangs curved out of its upper jaw. They looked very sharp. The claws were also white, like polished ivory, and slightly serrated on the inside curve. A line of small spikes ran down the creature's spine, from the base of its head to the tip of its tail. A hollow where its neck and shoulders joined created a larger than normal gap between the spikes. So that's our dragon. She's cute and small. She apparently is like holding her mouth open, like, feed me, I'm so hungry. And he's like, ugh. So he goes to touch her, and then he gets like this kind of shock, and it's like really painful, and it's really like, ugh. And he looks at his palm, and there's a shiny white mark that appears on his palm, which has a specific name, and I forget.
He basically gets a mark showing that he is a dragon rider and that they've bonded.
It's the Dragon Rider mark, and it's called, like, later when they're in a city that knows that dragon riders exist, they call him like the Silver Hand or something because he has that silver mark on his hand.
It's described as like opalescent.
Yeah. So he decides that he's going to make this little hut on the edge of the forest, like on the other side, because his family's a farming family. So he decides to make this little hut for her so he can hide her from his family. And he constructs it in the branches of a tree. He like finds all these leather cords in his house, which, like, what are those?
I mean, he also gets some of that good loose meat to feed him.
Oh, yeah. And so he finds out that this little baby dragon can pretty much immediately hunt on her own. He sees like a bunch of feathers inside the little hut. He's like, okay, she killed some. He doesn't know she's a she yet, but he's like, okay, she killed some birds. She grows really, really fast. So in a month, she's as tall as his shoulder. And he also finds that they have this mental link. She can't speak yet in words, but they can communicate through images and emotions.
The first time they connect mentally is actually quite nice because he talks about how like her mind is so vast that it feels like he's going to be overwhelmed by it, but then they feel comforted together as they like move together. And him being impressed by the vastness of people's minds is like a common thing, but it's really cute here.
Yeah, it works really well here in a way that I don't think that it works in other places.
Hmm.
Anyway, time passes and Aragon realizes that he won't be able to keep the dragon a secret for much longer, so he decides that he is going to need to tell his family. And I think it's in part because her tracks are so big in the snow and she's eating everything in the forest. He's like, people are going to ask questions about where these animals are going.
I made a comment early in the chapter because he like wakes up out of bed and he like brushes his hair and is like ready to go. And I was like, oh, no one's gonna pee in this entire story. But the only time anything like that is ever mentioned is he talks about how there's dung heaps that she's leaving around
Yeah.
that are getting pretty big. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, and he's like, I do not want to deal with those, which is really funny.
So relatable.
But also, yeah, he's 15. He probably doesn't want to deal with those. But before he tells his family, he decides to go to Brahm to learn a little more about dragons and possibly find a name for the dragon. So he goes to Brahm, and Brahm, exposits more about dragons and elves. He tells him that the first dragon rider's name was actually Eragon, who was an elf who found a dragon egg. Apparently, like, the history of dragons and elves and dwarves, there are also dwarves in this land, literally exactly like Lord of the Rings. It kind of feels like we have this diverging path, or this diverging path from the Lord of the Rings Middle Earth and this place, where like in Middle Earth the dragons kind of remained this antagonistic force.
You should just clarify a little bit. So the
Yeah,
dragons
sure.
were like eating everyone's livestock and making life
Yeah,
generally
they're stealing the dwarves' gold, which is funny.
and picking fights with elves. So like the elves and the dragons were having beef.
Yeah. So the dwarves are the indigenous people of the land with the dragons, and then the elves come over, similarly to how they come over from some unspecified place. I mean, it's specified in Lord of the Rings, but in this book it's unspecified where they come from. But yeah, continue.
I was just saying that they're beefing, and then this elf finds a dragon egg, and then they bond, and they're able to like talk to each other for the first time because apparently they couldn't talk before, even though there's like pretty well established magic that lets other creatures talk to other creatures' minds. But anyway, this is the first time they can talk, and they're like, through our powers of friendship, we will heal the wound in the earth. And then that like kind of works. The elves sort of found these dragon riders, and then at some point humans show up who are also non-indigenous to the earth. They don't explain it. They're just like, and then humans show up
Don't explain when humans appear. Yeah.
or where they came from.
Yeah.
And then that's how the dragon riders are formed. So he talks about that.
Yeah. The Dwarves were like shut them all themselves away when Galbatorix rose to power. They were like, all right, we're done here. We're gonna hide. So they're not interacting.
Yeah, and then it's just a string of Aragon asking a dragon-related question, and Brahm's like, "You're just curious, huh? Has nothing to do with any dragon-related activities you might have experienced." He doesn't pry like that, but it's like it's just Aragon being like, "I've totally fooled him. He
Obvious.
totally can't know what's happening."
He's kind of cute. Like he's 15. So he's like,
Yeah.
I'm so smart. And Brahm's like, uh-huh. And then Aragon's like, well, what were the dragons' names? And then Brahm gives him this list of names, which ends with he's like pausing and he's thinking and he's like, Saphira. And then Aragon leaves. Oh, Aragon went into town with his cousin to do, I don't remember what his cousin was doing. But on their way back, his cousin says to Aragon that he was offered a job as a miller in a town over. And then he's going to leave in a few weeks so that he can make enough money to marry actually Sloane's daughter, Katrina. And Eragon is upset by this. He's like, well, I don't think we should go. Like, we are supposed to stay together. He really is annoyed that Roran is planning on leaving, even though he's not leaving forever. He's just leaving to make some money during the winter when they can't really do anything on the farm. So he goes to see his dragon and she kind of calms him down. She says his name for the first time in his mind. And she's kind of trying to start to speak. And then he goes through this list of names and she's like, no, I don't want any of those. And he's like, well, why? And she's like, I just don't. And then he's like, oh, because you're a girl and those are boys' names. And then he gives her like the list of girls' names and she is like, oh, I like Saphira. So then she's named Saphira. And she continues growing. She learns to speak in their language in Aragon's mind, but she really doesn't want anyone to see her. She's like, I don't think it would be a good idea. So the weeks pass and then Roran leaves with this miller. So they go into town to see him off. But while in the village, Horst is like, hey, Eragon, there are two men with swords that are like really weird. And they have been asking about that stone that you had. And I didn't tell him anything, but like, Sloane. And then Eragon like sneaks around and he just like happens to hear Sloane talking to the most evil voiced men imaginable. They do see him and he like kind of takes off running and then he runs into Brahm and then the creatures see Brahm and then like they disappear and then Brahm is like, huh, that's weird. And then he goes to shake hands with Eragon but then grabs his wrist and reveals the mark on his palm and he's like, huh. And then Eragon runs away. He gets back to Saphira and she panics when he tells her that someone was looking for her egg and he says this to her and she's like, egg breakers, betrayer, killer of my species. And it's unclear how she knows about this.
They really toy the line with us throughout the book. Saphira is so clearly smarter than her age constantly. Aragon goes on these existential crises and like other things, and Saphira is always the one telling him, here's how you should live your life. And I'm like, all right, 4-month-old, calm down.
Yeah.
It's unclear if she's aware of what happened while she was in the egg, or if, like,
Oh,
as a
maybe.
dragon, she has connection to some sort of ancient knowledge.
Or if she just was able to read that part of Aragon's mind when he was being told that information by Brahm. It's completely unclear. It's never explained, but the way that it's presented makes it feel like she has this separate knowledge that wasn't given to her by Aragon. And it doesn't make any sense. Though I guess you could have a good theory where she is like recording information while she's in the egg. But she couldn't understand language, so that can't be right.
Could figure out a way to magically make it make sense. It is not explained in the book.
And like in Pern, Ramoth matures very quickly in her mental faculties, but it makes sense with Ramoth because she's surrounded by other dragons that she's telepathically talking to all the time. So there's this like ancient knowledge that's being passed to her constantly that Saphira knows two people. She knows Brahm and she knows Eragon for most of the book.
And in Dragon Riders of Pern, they're more animals, and then like the humans are like, here's what's up.
Yeah.
Saphira is this most down to earth, smartest.
She's really logical. She's like his therapist.
Yeah. I said she's like his mom, but we'll get to that.
Oh, she is kind of like his older sister, maybe.
But anyway, so she's like, monsters, and then she takes off.
Yeah, he had gotten on her back and he's like hugging her neck and trying to pet her because, he's trying to calm her down. But then, yeah, she takes off and he's on her back and this is their first flight together. And it's actually like, I like how
This is a great scene.
Yeah, it was great. He has a really bad time on this flight.
Love it.
Because the G-forces are hitting him for the first time. He gets really dizzy. He throws up. He's really uncomfortable. His muscles like kind of lock and he's terrified that he's going to fall off of her. And he's like trying to get her to land, but she is not listening to him and she's not responding. He explains it as like this mental barrier is formed in her mind just because she's so panicked. He can't connect with her. But he's just having this terrible experience with this flight, which makes sense. That would be really scary the first time that happens to you, especially if you aren't able to communicate in any meaningful way with the thing you're riding. And then when she finally lands, she actually lands in the area that he first found her egg. And he kind of falls off her back. His muscles are completely pulled because he was holding on so tight. And then he like looks at his legs and all of the skin on his thighs has been rubbed away from her scales because her scales are so sharp. So he's like, I can't ride you today. I'm in too much pain. We can't go back. And she's like, okay, well, we can stay here for the night. And she kind of curls around him and she's really, really warm. So he's able to stay warm even though it's winter. And she puts her little wing over him and she basically makes a little tent out of her body and they stay there for the night. Yeah. Is there anything you want to add there?
As you'll hear, most of the better scenes are in the beginning of.
Yeah, it was a good scene.
It's a really like, you thought dragon riding would be fun. Well, it's not fun bareback and without any support or anything. And it really gets to the physicality of it, which I really liked.
Yeah.
And I always like it when actions have consequences, a weird thing I enjoy in books. And this is one of the few times in the book where there's direct consequence in action that like feels earned.
Yeah. The next day they do travel back. He like rips his shirt apart and like stuffs the ripped fabric down his pants to give him a little bit more padding. And they get back and the house has been completely destroyed. And Garrow's inside, he is alive. So it does differ from A New Hope in that way. But it's basically that scene in A New Hope where Luke comes back and the moisture farm has been destroyed. But Eragon is able to kind of pull him out of the rubble with Saphira's help. They make a sled for him. Saphira tries to carry him into town, but she can't fly that far with him because she's still pretty small. So Eragon drags him the rest of the way, and then Brahm appears, and Brahm has like some blood on his face. And then Eragon faints.
First fate of the book.
He faints constantly. This boy, he eats so much meat, so it can't be an iron deficiency thing. Maybe he like just has low blood pressure. I don't know. This boy needs to like get some blood work done or something because he faints so many times.
This is a book about tropes, and this is one of the ones that they beat into the dirt. It's just like, I've exerted myself too much. I'm exhausted. Ugh, and then faint. And it's just
I kind of think because he faints a lot in battles too. Every battle he loses, he faints in. And some battles that he wins, he still faints. And I kind of think it's like the author saying, well, he wouldn't give up unless he was rendered unconscious. Like he would never give up. So instead of just like having him lose a fight, he faints. And I really think the author thinks like, oh, that's a better way of like, he would have won if he didn't faint kind of thing. If he hadn't gotten hit on the head or whatever.
Oh, I always took it as I need to get out of this scene. What's a good way to get out of the scene? Oh, the point of view character fades to black. It's just like a...
Yeah, then we can cut to the next scene. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It's like so annoying how many times the boy faints. Anyway, he wakes up in the healer's hut and then goes to see Garrow because the healer's hut is like too small for two people, which like seems an unnecessary plot contrivance. And he goes to Horst's house where Garrow is being held. And Garrow has like a nice house. It's described really nice. Like all of the like wood is like carved. It's 2 stories. It has a balcony that overlooks the mountains. It's gorgeous. Nothing else is described like this in this book. Anyway, Garrow's wounds are not healing well and he has a fever. So Eragon stays with him. He talks with Horst, and Horst is like, there were like all these monster tracks around your house. Did you see those? And Eragon was like, no, I didn't see those. I don't know what those could have been. Horst is like, oh, that's weird. And Eragon's like, yeah, that is weird. I don't know. I didn't see them.
Like, hey, why is the inside of your thighs chafe like you were riding something for hours? And he's like,
I don't know. I don't remember that happening.
ugh.
Which is like a 15-year-old thing to do. I don't know. I felt like that was realistic to a 15-year-old's logic. But then Garrow dies that night. After Garrow dies, he overhears Horst talking about him, and Horst's like, I think I need to question him again because his story doesn't make sense. And he's like, oh no, they're gonna find out about Saphira, and then he leaves. So he sneaks out. He steals some leather from the tanner and hides it while he then goes to steal like as much meat as he can from Sloane. And then when he goes back to grab the stowed leather, Brahm is there. And Brahm's like, what are you doing? Where are you going? And Eragon's like, nowhere. I'm not doing anything. And then Brahm's like, I know that you're a dragon rider. I've spoken to Saphira and I'm going with you. And Eragon's like, I don't need your help, but you can come, which is very funny. Like, that's literally what he says. That's the quote. So they go back to the house and Eragon grabs some supplies, including his bow. And then they leave. Brahm gives Eragon a lightsaber. Sorry, he gives him a sword.
He gives him a bright red sword with a red sheath, and the sword is color coded because it used to belong to an evil red dragon, because the swords are coded to dragons.
It's made specifically for the rider at the end of their training to match the scales of their dragon. It's a lightsaber, and it's like better than every other sword. If you haven't figured it out at this point, Brahm is literally Obi-Wan. He's Obi-Wan. And like Eragon's like holding the sword and he's thinking like, oh, it's weighted perfectly. It feels great in the hand. It's like, when have you ever held a sword? You would have never held a sword, ever. Like the reason that the two creatures that, killed his uncle were noticeable in town is because they had swords. Like Horst is like, it's weird that they had swords. No one carries swords. So like, how would he know what a good sword is? He wouldn't know. The sword's name is Zarok, by the way.
Yeah. Can I let you know two things that annoyed me that are very important for the next part of the story? So Garrow is found with burns that are like apparently not related to the burnt out house. And then also he has Garrow in his hands under the pile of rubble has a strip of fabric from the cloak of the people who attacked him. So we know exactly who did it. It was the
We couldn't have
monster.
guessed. We couldn't have guessed without that.
There's two evil monsters in the wearing cloaks earlier in the book, and they're like coming to get him, and they've been pointed out specifically by the only like shitty character, the butcher in the book. And it's just like, who could have done this? And then he sees a patch of fabric in his dying uncle's hand, and it's like, it's those people. I couldn't have put two and two together to figure this out.
The implication is that Garrow was tortured before they burned the house down because they were trying to question him, but it's unclear. Anyway, we're at the threshold crossing section of the hero's journey, in case you were wondering. The next day, Brahm uses the leather that Eragon stole to make a saddle for Saphira, and they camp, and Brahm shows Eragon how to fight. They use sticks instead of a sword, and he gives Eragon a concussion basically immediately because he's a terrible teacher. That's not how you start teaching someone how to do anything, let alone how to duel. He's like a terrible teacher. He's constantly like really hurting Eragon, which I thought was going to become like because the sword is dangerous and you need to know how dangerous it is and you shouldn't pick up a sword lightly. I thought he was going to have like a speech like that. That never happens. Everything with the sword is like, this sword is so fucking cool and I'm using it and I'm so cool. I don't know. He's not a good teacher. And then they buy horses the next day. Brahm pays a highwayman who's like, you have to pay to cross this bridge. And then he immediately like cuts his purse and the highwayman doesn't realize it until later. And I think this is supposed to make us think that he's like cool, but it is so unnecessary and didn't need to happen. It like feels like the "these are not the droids you're looking for" line from A New Hope. That's what it is. Brahm is so annoying in a lot of places. They buy these two horses, one of which is like the best horse that this horse breeder in this podunk town has ever produced. And he's so proud of it. And he's like, I'm so happy that this horse exists. And I'm so excited to sire many children from this horse. And then Brahm's like, well, how much will you part with it? And he's like, no, I can't part with the horse. And he's like, well, name a theoretical number. And the guy's like, 200 crowns. And then Brahm's like, here you go. And he's like, oh no, I didn't want to part with this horse. And I felt for the guy. You mentioned that you also felt for the guy. Do you want to talk about it?
It's just a very silly thing because he's like, "I'm gonna breed a bunch of really good horses and get a lot of money for him," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's probably worth more than one horse." And then Brahm's like, "I'm gonna give you that," but also like I don't understand so the horse's name Starfire,
Snowfire.
Snowfire. So the horse is a ridiculous fantasy name,
Yeah.
and it's just like it's just in some podunk town in the middle of nowhere is like the best horse in the world. The horse trader makes Brahm promise to take good care of it, which is eventually like a promise that Eragon takes up. It's just silly.
The horse must like come into play in a later book. Maybe, I don't know. They can't. The reason they're not riding Saphira, if you are wondering that, is because she's just not big enough yet for two people to ride her. We'll get into why this later doesn't make any sense.
And even though she flies so fast, they can't fly one person all the way there and then have them sit and wait and then have the other person come back and fly them there because that would be.
Good point.
So they're in horses the whole
The
time.
whole time. Ugh. Okay. Anyway, so they get these horses and then they pass into a plains land.
Oh,
Aragon.
wait, it's really important to know that Aragon reaches out with his mind to talk to the horse, and then he's like, I can talk to horses. So Aragon is our first canonical horse girl. We found one. Congratulations, everybody.
Yeah.
But also, he tells Brahm that, and he's like, wow, only the most specialist, goodest riders could talk to other animals without training. You must be one of the best specialist, most goodest boys to ever be a rider.
So all dragon riders, because of the bond, can use magic. Now, it's not the same for each rider. Some only have a weak amount of magic and some have a ton of magic. And it's a secret that the dragon riders actually keep. So this is not common knowledge. Most people don't know that all dragon riders can use magic. They just assume that the people who like show that they can use magic who are dragon riders must have been able to use magic before they became a rider. But Brahm's like, no, that magic comes from the dragon. So he says that even though elves, I think, can use magic independently of dragons, and most of the riders were actually elves.
Yeah, once again, it's a thing where they're like, this is a rule. Ignore all of the other things that also would kind of fit into this. And you're like, okay. Yeah, it's a bit soupy.
Yeah, and also like never comes up again. It's like not important that we know that at all. It's really not important that we know that. Like we could have just gone through this whole book without knowing that and wouldn't have been an issue. Anyway, they pass into this plains land, and it's the first time that Aragon's ever like not been in the mountains. So he's like, "Ooh, I don't like this." There's like a night where Aragon tries to light a fire, but the wind is too strong. So Brahm and like the brush is too wet, and he's like, "I can't do it." And then Brahm starts doing it, and then he says a magic word, Brissinger. Aragon at the time just thinks he's swearing, and then the fire lights, and he's like, "Oh, he swore," and then the fire started. A storm then comes the next day when they're riding, and Saphira is almost blown away, and they have to like jump on her wings to keep her down so she doesn't blow away. And this is really where I thought that the book's writing really dropped off.
So agree. This was kind of like the last thing I enjoyed because for a while it was like things just kind of kept happening. Like you don't go too long, or, like you'll have like an action scene and then Brahm will do a bunch of exposition and then you'll have an action scene and then Brahm will do some exposition and some training and like explain to him what something that like hasn't come up at all.
Doesn't come up. Like he over explained, the world is so over explained in a way that
Yeah.
you think would make you understand it better, but you don't. Yeah, it really sounds like the author's like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And I know you might be listening and thinking, well, Lord of the Rings kind of does that. The reason it works in Lord of the Rings, even in the most like, oh my God, why are we with Tom Bombadil for so long kind of section, which like, look, I'm no hate on Tom Bombadil. I'm not saying that he's bad. I'm just don't come at me. It's fine. He's great. But like it's kind of like the reason that it works with Lord of the Rings and with Tolkien's writing is because Tolkien is working with a storytelling tradition that already has that in it. Like he is the reason that we have modern translations of a ton of Arthurian legends and a ton of writing from the Middle Ages which do that specifically. And him doing that in The Lord of the Rings makes it feel like it's a part of those storytelling traditions, that it's existing, it's this story that existing and is coming to us from a different time. It makes it feel like folklore, it makes it feel old. And Tolkien could do that because he was a master of his craft and he was a scholar and had read all of these stories and knew them on an intimate level and understood them. It doesn't work with Eragon because Christopher Paolini, like maybe he read some of these legends, but he at 15 would not have this intimate understanding of these legends on like a more critical level and a, close reading level that Tolkien would have had. So it just sounds like it's like the ghost of, or like a copy of a copy of a copy of Lord of the Rings style writing. And it's really, really frustrating. Also, these scenes don't build on each other. Yeah, what did you want to say?
I was gonna say, I think that's right. A lot of this book feels like a copy of a copy. So you're like, is this from this book specifically, or is it that book? The like he's aware that fantasy exists, and this is sort of a trope, so he's like pulling it out to work on it.
Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna add one thing that I think one of the reasons I think this doesn't work also is that it's not internally consistent, you know?
Mhm.
Like sometimes he'll say stuff in these like long expositions that Brahm is doing about the world, and then later on there will be something that like kind of contradicts it or like doesn't super make sense within the bounds of it, and it just ends up confusing you more.
Yeah, we also know that Brahm is a storyteller. He's lived as a storyteller for Aragon's entire life in this town, but never once does he actually give us this exposition while they're on this journey through a story. He's always just like answering Aragon's random questions and then being like, "Well, I won't tell you that. I won't tell you that. I told you that I wasn't going to tell you that." He's not like, "Here, let me tell you this story that through the telling of the story, we then get this information on the world." And it's why make him a storyteller at all if he's never telling stories? Storytellers love to tell stories. That's what they do. We all know that person in our life who's a storyteller, and you're like, and every time you talk to them, you're like, all right, I'm gonna hear a story. It's gonna be great, and it's great. He never tells another story. He sings like one elf song that's completely irrelevant to the rest of this book. It doesn't do what I just said it should be doing. The other reason that these action scenes don't work, like with Saphira being battened down by the wind, is they're not built upon later in the book. Like, so we could have had this scene and then Saphira's kind of afraid of high winds because she doesn't want to get blown away. Or maybe it hurts her wings, so then she's not able to fly as fast. Or maybe like she's thrashing around and she hits Aragon with her claw, or and then Aragon's like, oh, I keep forgetting that she's actually this really dangerous beast because I have this mental bond with her and I need to remember that she could hurt me accidentally. None of that actually happens in any of these scenes. It's just like this scene happened anyway, moving on. And it's so frustrating because it just feels like our time is being wasted. They reach a town that has been destroyed by Urgles, and like there's a pile of bodies in the middle of the town.
And naturally gruesome for like everything else that's been here. They like before they're just like bopping around in like a
Mhm.
cute little fantasy town, and then they're like on the woods. And then all of a sudden there's a pile of mangled corpses with like a spear sticking out of a dead baby, and you're just like, that's too hard. I'm so sorry. You can't go from like 1 to 11.
Yeah. Yeah, so two Urgles are still there. Aragon tries to run, he can't run. Brom is trying to fight one, but he gets hurt and isn't able to really continue fighting. And then Aragon is like trying to shoot the one Urgle with his bow, but it keeps like the arrows keep glancing off of the Urgle. And then he has this moment of clarity and he's like, I'm not afraid anymore. And then this word jumps to his lips as he shoots the arrow, which is that word that Brom said earlier, Brissinger. And then the arrow lights on fire, and then a shockwave shoots out as it hits the Urgle and kills both of the Urgles instantly. And then Aragon is immensely tired, but he doesn't pass out here.
Pickiest nitpick about this is that they're in a fantasy town that's got to be like a small fantasy town, and then like the Urgles like trap him in like an alleyway, like Batman style, and it's just such a weird like, what? There's alleyways in this fantasy town that's like a small border. It's
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just
makes
such
no
like a
sense.
small thing where it's just like, where are we?
Well, this is where I was always very confused whenever they were in these kinds of places because I felt like they weren't described very well.
Uh,
So I never got a sense of what they actually looked like. I was like, "Oh, I guess that I guess that could be true."
yeah.
Yeah, so later that night, Brahm tells Aragon the rules of magic, which is basically a clunkier Earthsea. Do you wanna describe this?
Yeah, sure. This is another thing where he like tells you about it, and then it's like this actually is like super important throughout the book, but it's so
Mhm.
nebulous that you can't really ever figure it out. But basically, like whatever you do with magic, you have to do with like your energy. So like you could heal a wound, but it would cost as much energy as like healing the wound normally would. So like if it's a grievous wound, it could like kill you. If or like if you go to kill someone, then like if that's too much energy and it's all of your energy to like kill someone, after you cast the spell, it'll just like get sucked out of you, even though you like don't want to put that much energy into it.
But you can't take back a spell once cast it. But the reason it's like Earthsea is because it's a word-based magic system where there's a true word for everything on the planet, and that true word grants you control of that object. It's like, yes, that is a magic system that existed before Earthsea, but it is exactly like Earthsea, and the author has said that he was heavily influenced by Earthsea. So I feel like he just lifted this from Earthsea. Also, people have a true name too.
Yeah,
Um,
we talked about it because like I'm Jewish and like in Hebrew mysticism, like true names have a lot of power. So obviously this
yeah.
concept has been around for a while, but this book is a copy of a copy of a copy. So like
Mhm.
Ursi took that obviously from like a tradition and like created its own version of it, and then somebody else probably did it, and then he just took that and was like, yeah, people don't know what I'm talking about. I don't actually need to create a magic system out of this, and then just like ran with it.
And like I'm sure that there are other fantasy books, and I've definitely read other fantasy books where the magic system is word based, but it doesn't feel like just Earthsea, but different. Or like, they changed it enough, or they were taking it from that older folklore and religion, or like religious tradition, but you don't feel it quite the same way in Earthsea because the way that she explains the magic system in Earthsea is so beautiful and feels so like so lovely the way that we are introduced to the magic system that you accept it. But in this, it's just like Brahm just telling him all the rules, like rule number 1, rule number 2, rule number 3, and you're like, "Oh my god, this is not the way. This is not the way to give us this information."
And also the way they deal with power is super
Yeah.
nebulous. Like in Ursi, it was pretty clear that the thing that sort of held people back from like abusing their power or overusing it was, a notion of balance in the world, but also just like unintended consequences. Like that was a big worry. And in this one, the only unintended consequences is that you don't have enough magic juice in your body to like be able to finish this spell off, and if you're not careful then that'll kill you.
It kills you immediately.
Yeah, but also Aragon is the most specialist boy, so he can just like will his way through the situation because even though that amount of power would kill him, he's got protagonist juice.
But he also has Saphira, and Saphira can like lend him power. So he has this like extra thing. But we don't really feel it in this book. Like in Earthsea, when Jed overextends his power, he like kind of becomes comatose and he's existing in this place between life and death. And it takes other people to help pull him back out. And you feel like this weight to it in that book. And you don't feel that in this book. It's just like, oh, I feel the power draining from me, and then Saphira's like, I got you, and then she's like, let me lend you my power, and then he's totally fine, and then you're like, okay, and then we move to the next scene.
Or he just takes a power nap and we pop up in the next scene and he's like, ah, how long have I been gone for? And they're like, a day and a half. And they're like, ah.
Yeah, and he doesn't ever think about it again. He never really thinks about, like, Jed is constantly thinking about his power, and for multiple reasons, but Aragon's just like, anyway. The other thing that I have a question about this magic system, so like first thing Brahm really teaches him is like pick up the stone without picking it up, like pick it up with your mind. And then that like takes the same energy, which is also so Star Wars. Oh my God, with Yoda. So he like picks up this stone with his mind, and he's like, that takes the same amount of energy as picking up the stone if you were to just pick it up. But there are things that they can do with magic that you can't do physically. Like you can't read someone's mind. Like would that be the same as them talking to you?
Yeah, no, the mind stuff is like outside of the magic system because you just do that with the power of your mind. I mean, there's other stuff which is like a really cool version of this book would be like, okay, you can only do stuff that you like was is within your power, and then maybe
Yeah,
you get like a like an extra bonus because you got a dragon.
that's
I
true.
would love to see him like throwing pebbles or like slicking the ground, small things that would be like really cool in a battle against a non-magical entity. But
Yeah.
what he does is basically what you see in the previous scene where he just starts blowing people up with magic.
He like blows people back. Like he explodes a door. And I'm like, well, how do you just like explode a door without magic? You can't.
Anyway,
We have a training montage. Eragon gets better at magic and with his sword because he's good at everything. Everything he does is like a straight line up. He never struggles. Saphira also is taller than a horse now. They go through a town, but it's not important. Saphira gets mad that Eragon won't ride her, which you'd think would be like a little bit more about like him being kind of scared to ride her again, but we don't get that. But they decide that he will ride her every other day so that he can talk with Brahm every other day and we can get that exposition. Then he and Brahm duel for the first time with real swords, but they dull the edges with magic, which how much energy does that take? I want to know. And anyway, then they talk about reading people's minds, and this is when we get like the whole thing about how Galbatorix is really good about breaking into people's minds. The next day he flies with Saphira, and this is a much different flying experience than he had before. He is able to stay on her much better. He mind melds with her, so he's able to experience what flying is like for her, and he's really exhilarated. And she's really excited because she's like, I knew you would like it, and she's just happy to be with him. And it's a cute scene. I thought that was really quite sweet that like it shows how much they care about each other and how important they are to each other in this scene. Then he feels this buzzing in his head, which is Brahm trying to mentally like talk to him. So he's like texting him, and Brahm's like, "Hey, you got to get down here." Yeah. Did you have anything that you wanted to add about that scene?
that's a great scene. I feel like with a lot of these books, the scenes where dragon riders fly the dragons are like good scenes, which is nice, but it'd be nice if there was other good scenes in this book.
Yeah. So Brahm calls him down and he's like, I found these weird tracks because they've been tracking the Razak for this whole time, which were the men who killed his uncle. And they're not human. They're like these weird creatures that wear heavy cloaks because they can't go out in the sun and they're more powerful at night. And they are basically the Black Riders from Lord of the Rings, but there are only 2 of them instead of 9. And he says that they must be using these flighted animals because they see these like tracks in the ground, and they're similar to what the tracks look like when Saphira lifts off. This turns out to matter absolutely not at all because we never see these flighted animals. I assume they're like the fell beasts that they're riding in Lord of the Rings. They also just happened to find a canister of Seether oil, which is that oil that we were talking about earlier. They find this canister of Seether oil, just happened to find it. They just forgot it, I guess, this really expensive, important oil that they use when they torture people that only burns flesh. It like so you can put it on like a blanket and it won't damage the blanket, but then if someone wraps their blanket around themselves, it'll burn their flesh, which is like a myth thing. Medea uses something similar to that in when she like sends that dress to in her. It's not important, but that's like a myth thing. But they're like, oh, we can use because like apparently Seether oil is like really hard to make, and only a few places make it. So they're like, we can track down who is selling the Seether oil to figure out where they're sourcing it from.
It's a total crazy thing that they're just like, oh, wow, we found this oil. And you know what we can do? We're just going to go to a port town and go through every book that's ever existed to find the inventory of who like sells this weird specific oil and find it. And it's just,
No sense.
it
Like
makes no sense.
even in this day and age with the way that technology is, it is sometimes really hard for law enforcement to track down where people are sourcing things from. when they're sourcing things like illegally. How in this medieval society do they think that this is going to work?
So they're gonna get where it's dropped off at, which I assume is a barrack somewhere, and then they can just pick it up. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make sense. Anyway, but Brom's like, that's a great idea. And so that's that's what they do. And then we get more training montage. They finally do get to the coastal city where they meet Geode, which is an old friend of Brom. He takes them to his office to talk because he doesn't trust his wife, I guess, because his wife is like just frowning at them the whole time because he doesn't know how to write women.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The most unnecessary character.
Why did she exist at all? She doesn't need to exist at all. They could have just like not had her. It was so weird. She's so
She just exists to be slightly put off in like 2 to 3 scenes. She doesn't say anything though. She's just mildly annoyed.
yeah. And he's like, oh, she's annoyed because I lost all of her father's money. It's like, yeah, I'd probably be pissed at that too. So Brom and Geode talk, and like Geode's like, I thought you were dead. Brom's like, I had to let people think that. And Aragon knows that they're purposefully hiding things from him. He sends out to like go see if the horses are doing okay. And Aragon is like listening in with enhanced hearing that he enhances through magic. Brom is like, the thing we were looking for, I happened to find in a box outside of the town of Gilead, and blah blah blah. And he basically is saying like, yeah, I found Saphira's egg outside of it randomly in this box, and I was able to take it to the bar, but without saying it. But like we as the reader are like, yeah, this is what happened. Although like it isn't until later in the story that it's like, anyway, reveal this is what happened. It's like, yeah, we know because we listened to that story. And Aragon's like dumb, even though everyone tells him how smart he is all the time. But then they decide like that there's like someone who like keeps track of all the records. The people who are the like traders aren't allowed to keep their own records because of tax reasons, because the government thinks that they'll commit tax fraud, which probably. So they're going to have to like talk to this guy about seeing these records. And so Aragon's like, well, why couldn't we just like use magic to see these records? Like use our magic eyes to like send our eyes into the book and look at them. And Brom's like, well, you can only, when you're scrying, you can only see things that you've seen before. So if I'm scrying you and you're somewhere that I've never been before, then I would only see you in like a white void. And then he's like, it also takes a lot of energy, which apparently it doesn't actually take a lot of energy because Eragon does it all the time and it doesn't seem to affect him at all. The next day, Eragon explores the town and he met Angela the day before, but he like really talks to her today and her weird cat whose name is Solomon.
Can we pause for a second?
Oh, sure.
And just because the way that this book treats the concept of a weircat as a totally normal thing that does not need to be explained is possibly the funniest part of this book for me. And they're just like, anyway, here's a weird cat. And you're just like, what the frick's a weird cat? And it's like, oh, that's just Solobud. He's a cat that's a weird cat. He talks in riddles.
Sometimes he's a little boy.
Yeah.
With like a sprig of some specific plant in his hair. He's like a transplant from some other story. He must be, right? He doesn't fit.
He's so random.
Yeah.
And he comes out of nowhere. Eragon's just walking around, poking to things, and then he walks into this dark place, and he's like, oh, and then a cat jumps up, and he's like, hello, cat. And he's like, I can talk to you too, because I am a weird cat. And he's like, oh, weird cat. And I'm like, what is a weird cat? Why are we pretending like this is an established thing?
Everything in this book is so over-explained, except for this. And then there's one other thing that bugged the crap out of me when Eragon wasn't like, well, why? Because he's always asking, why? He's that kid. And there's this one thing that happens later that he doesn't ask why. And I'm like, but why? Yeah. So anyway, you're totally right. Anyway, Solemnbum, because he's able to communicate telepathically with this cat thing, Angela's like, well, there are only 2 other people have been able to do that, and I told them that I would read their fortune when they did that, so I'm going to read your fortune too. And she like brings out these dragon knuckle bones and like throws them. She really reminds me of Min from the Wheel of Time, because Min does this too. And I think that this probably is more of a tenuous stretch, but like because so much else is taken just plopped in this book, like I like that, I'm going to mix it in there into this soup that I'm creating. It just really feels like, because Min like kind of pops up and you're like, how did she get there? And then she tells you like some random vague future, and you're like, that helps me not at all in this part of the story. Like maybe it'll become interesting like 3 books in this giant series, but I didn't need that. I didn't need a fortune teller to tell me random bullshit. Ugh, I have trouble personally with fortune tellers.
I mean, this is so heavy-handed too.
Yeah.
Angela's like, this is a hard fortune, but you're gonna live forever. And
Yeah.
you're gonna marry a
You're
noblewoman
gonna have the
and
greatest love story of all time, she
and
says.
yeah, and also that you're gonna be in a giant confrontation between good or evil. And I'm like, I'm aware we're in a fantasy story, and I know someone close to you is going to die.
Yeah,
And
and she
he's
also says someone's gonna betray you, and then she says you're gonna leave this place and never come back, which I don't know that this is true, but I kinda think it's like in the end of Lord of the Rings when Frodo leaves for Valinor. I think that's, like, what happens. I think he goes to leave and live with the elves for the rest of his.
basically there's just a useless scene in this book where they're like, by the way, this is a fantasy novel and fantasy novel stuff's gonna happen. And Aragon's like, cool, and then never brings it up.
Like, who is left to die? I've already lost everyone. It's like, you have one person left, you have Brom. You can't figure that one out. Like, hopefully it's not gonna be Saphira, but it's one of those 2. You have 2 things left.
He thinks it's his cousin who never shows up or he thinks about much ever again
He
the book.
thinks his cousin's going to be the one to betray him, is what he thinks. He's like, Rory wouldn't do that. And she's like, I don't know your cousin. She like says that to him. But the important thing is, she also is like, the woman who I read the fortune to, her name was Selena, and she was really sad by her fortune. And then Aragon's like, that's my mom's name. What did you tell her? And she's like, well, I don't remember. Which is like, really? You've done this 3 times in your life and you don't remember? How do you not remember something like that?
With it because we meet Angela and she's like, I'm trying to prove toads don't exist because if they don't exist, then you can't do toad based magic. And I'm just like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I hope she only says the dumbest, weirdest things and is just like not at all helpful. That's great. I hope there's just a character that just says nonsense then like pieces.
Apparently, she's based on his sister, Christopher Paolini's sister, who is also named Angela.
Oh. Anyway, she's like a weird, useless plot device.
She's a manic pixie dream girl. That's what she is.
Yeah. Neither her nor the weird cat make sense, and then they vanish from the book for what you think is forever.
Well, they come back in the end, I
Yeah,
guess.
but it's just like, and then they're gone.
Yeah, they randomly appear in the end, but whatever. It's so annoying. And then Brahm's that night like, hey, Eragon, do you know how to read? And Aragon's like, no. And Brahm's like, Garrow never taught you how to read? And Aragon's like, Garrow could read? And Brahm's like, yeah, he could read. He never taught you? And Aragon's like, no. So then they spend the next few weeks teaching Eragon how to read. But like,
They spend 1 week.
why?
He learns to read in a week.
He learns to read in a week. Also, like, why did they even do that? Like, why couldn't he just be like, yeah, Garrow taught me?
Would have saved like 3 pages to be like, yep, I know how to read a normal 16-year-old thing.
Especially if his uncle did know how to read. Like, it would make sense. Like, it would make sense if Garrow didn't know how to read, you know? But like, he says that he did know how to read. So why are we doing this? He learns to read proficiently in a week, which is impossible. And also, like, the older you get, it's harder to learn how to read. So he's 15 and a half right now. He's almost 16. It would probably be really difficult for him to start reading. But he's special. He's good at everything. So they take this week. We have another training montage also in this week. Eragon visits Saphira during this time, and he kind of thinks about how he doesn't like to be away from her, and that he's afraid she's lonely, and he really doesn't like being in the city because he can't be with her, which understood that. I kind of wish that was explored a little bit more, but it's not. Eragon then has this dream about a young woman in a cell. So then they sneak into the records room through this ridiculous means. And look through all of the records. Solumbum appears on the window and is like, hey, there are guards coming, you should go. But then they still like get all the records that they need. So it didn't really feel like there was any stakes. Like nothing was changed by the fact that there was just no reason for this. So then they get back to Geode's home, And he looks through, they're like looking at a map and they're like looking at the records and they're like, oh, the Razak must be in the city of Drosleona. So you have to go there. And that's it. And then they leave the next day. And Geode's wife, whose name is Helen, like glares at them while they leave. And then Brahm is like, you should be so lucky to be the wife of Geode. You should be a better wife to him. It's like, fuck you, Brahm. Fuck you. Anyway.
I dislike Brahm so much. Eragon is like, hey, could you like give me some more information? Because like, you know how like earlier in the book you didn't warn me about the Razak and then my uncle was brutally murdered?
Didn't warn him about how magic can be dangerous to use, and then he overextended himself the first time he used magic because he didn't know that he was using magic.
There's all of these instances where Aragon's like, hey, could you like freely share information with me? Because like I don't know what's happening and you seem to know a lot. And it's literally a matter of life and death. And Brahm's like, I'll tell you later. It's like a kind of personal for me, and I like don't feel comfortable sharing it with you. And it's like, bro, just tell him. I know you're holding out for the reveal later, and it's not worth it. It's not worth it.
We also learned that Saphira is talking to Brahm this whole time with her mind, and that she is getting more information from him. Like he's telling her more things, because then after Brahm dies, she's like, well, Brahm told me this, and Brahm told me this. And it's like, well, why did he trust Saphira and not just trust Eragon?
Yeah, spoiler alerts, I guess, for Brahm dying in like 20 more minutes of plot.
Well, we know that because of Angela.
Yeah, Angela's prophecy.
Anyway, they leave. Brahm tells Eragon about how Saphira's egg was stolen from the king and how the Razak found Carvajal.
You find out that there's 2 other eggs that have not hatched that like he stole and has been kind of like waiting to hatch so we can start the Dragon Riders again.
Galbatorix, just to clarify. Yeah.
So there's like 2 other eggs out there. That's like the most important part.
Yeah. Saphira, well, I'll get into it later. Eragon randomly breaks his wrist, like fully breaks it, while investigating a footprint that an Orgal left.
He can't be uninjured. Like literally this book is like first his legs hurts, then his like ribs hurt, and then like his wrist hurts, and like at like as soon as he heals up, he gets a new injury.
But it doesn't really affect him at all. Like he's not.
No.
I guess he like it learns to fight with his left hand while his wrist is. You think it would be like, my wrist is weaker because it broke, which is a thing.
He's just grumpy throughout. I mean, I didn't mind that he was hurt a bunch because I thought it kind of added character, like added complications to the scenes. Not really, especially after the 3rd time.
It didn't add enough. I think it would be different if it really did add. Like he broke his wrist, so he really can't do something, and then it makes it harder for them to journey forward. But it doesn't really seem to affect them.
But anyway, so he breaks the wrist.
So they've realized that these Urgals are like really approaching them and gaining on them. So this leads to this chase through the forest where Eragon is on Saphira, but he realizes that the Urgals are going to catch up with Brahm. So he lands Saphira in front of them and then uses magic to like knock these giant creatures backwards and passes out because he overextends himself with the magic. He then wakes up alone and he's like, I wonder where they are. And he tries to contact Saphira, but she's too far away. So he practices scrying and he sees Brahm is riding Saphira and he's like, okay, they're fine. Then he like scries Roran. He's like, I wonder what Roran's up to. And Roran's like sitting in a chair, but he can't see the chair. So he's like, I guess Roran's not home yet. But like his house was destroyed. So it would be a chair that he would never have seen. The chair was destroyed. Anyway. And then he's like, I wonder if I could scry things that I've only seen in dreams. So he tries to scry the woman and he is able to see her. She looks at him and then she passes out. And he's like, whoa. Then Brahm returns and yells at him. And he's like, you overextended yourself. Instead of trying to push the Urgals back, you should have lifted up a stone and shot them through the Urgals' heads.
Which like, yes.
Would have been way cooler.
Way cooler.
Then he says that he and Saphira were chasing down the Urgals, but 3 of them escaped. And this is the first time we see Eragon be like, I didn't want to kill anybody. Which, like, sure. But he already killed 2 Urgals. Like,
you already killed 2 Urgals and you never bring it up.
He never thinks about it. He's never like, I feel really bad about killing those guys. But then when he is faced with killing more people or Urgals, he is kind of sometimes like, I really don't want to do it. And then sometimes he like gleefully does. And it doesn't really make sense. They reach Leona Lake, which is outside of Draciona, and Eragon and Saphira take a swim, which is a cute scene. I like this scene, but I don't understand how no one saw them because it's a lake.
The implication I got is like it's a great lake, in that like
Yeah, but
if you're in Erie, you can't see to the other side of it. But yeah, no one ever sees Saphira
no one
despite her
ever
being a
does.
giant dragon
Who's
flying around.
flying? And like you're not familiar with this lake, so you don't know that there might be like a town that you just don't see. I don't know. It's fine. Then Aragon beats Brahm in a sword fight for the first time. Brahm explains how magic fights work, which kind of didn't make sense to me. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this.
You're right. It doesn't make any sense. Basically, wizard duels are a one shot. If you do your one magic shot without being in the mind of the other wizard, they can magic one shot you. If you use magic in a magic duel without like controlling the other person's mind, it's just like mutually assured destruction, which is maybe a thing that comes up at the end of the book, but doesn't.
Comes up in a later book. But like, why would you care? If you're like, I could die, just like try to get the other guy out of there before. And like, how do you know that the other guy's gonna like honor that part of the duel anyway?
It works with all magic is just I'm gonna cast the death spell on you, and it's like, oh no, if you cast the death spell, I'll cast the death spell on you, and completely ignores what I call cool magic. I don't know, shooting a stone at them that knocks them unconscious, or like, I don't know, put ice on the ground to like trip them, and then there's
Just cause an aneurysm to happen in their brain. I don't know, like stop their blood from flowing. Like there's so many things you could do that aren't just like the dead spell, the explosion spell that they never. Nah. They enter the city, which is a hellhole, and it has this really weird religion. And there's this like rock formation, but it may also be a castle. This was where I was really confused. I didn't understand what this thing that exists outside the city was that they like prayed to. They like worship this. I think it's a rock formation, but I wasn't sure what it was. Do you know what it was?
so they get into the city. It's a really fucked up, weird city that doesn't really matter in any context other than like
No.
literally the city itself is evil. So you're like bad times.
Yeah, I think that the author was like, I like this concept, so I'm going to put it in here. Because they have this really weird religion that like they cut body parts off of themselves to worship this like rock formation thing that's ill described. And then Saphira's like, I am never going to join Galbatorix, so don't even think about it because he killed baby dragons, which like is fair. And she's like, so you're going to join the Varden, right? Which is this like rebel group. And to this point, Aragon has been like, well, I don't want to fight for my entire life. I just like I want to go home. Like, and she's like, no, you don't. You're not going to be able to go home after you've experienced all of this. And so she gets him to admit that he will join the Varden after they finish tracking down the Razak.
A lot of emotional stakes that are brought up randomly throughout the book. One of them is whether or not he wants to live and what's the meaning of life. That happens after his uncle dies, and he's like, what's the meaning of life? And then Saphira, who at this point is like 3 months old, is like, the meaning of life is like doing, you
She literally says, do or do not, there is no try. Like
yeah,
she says what Yoda says.
yeah, it's weird. And that she's like, don't worry, I have the meaning of life figured out, but we're not talking about it because it's so stupid. But there's also where does Eragon want to end up? Because at first he's like, I just want to kill the people who killed my uncle. And Brahm's like, that's cool. We can talk about you joining the rebels later. And Eragon's like, what? And he's like, all right, I'll think about it. And then, like, as they keep going, Eragon's like, oh, the Emperor's so evil. He's, like, gross and all. And Saphira's like, yeah, we should join the rebel army. And he's like, oh, I kind of want to just vibe. And I'm like, I get that you're 50.
Yeah.
You don't want to, like...
Yeah.
But it's like this weird thing that they kind of talk about. And we know that the Empire is evil. So we're like, yeah, you probably should join the rebels. But we don't really know anything about the rebels. So it's a weird nebulous thing. Anyway.
Yeah, so Aragon explores the town, which seems like a bad plan, and then gets attacked by the Razak. He and Brahm narrowly escape the city. They think that they're safe once they're camping that night. Then Aragon gets smacked on the head and passes out. And then when he wakes up, he's been captured and drugged. So he can't use his magic. The Razak are about to kill Brahm, and then a bunch of arrows come out of nowhere and shoot them. We have our Deus Ex Machina right here. The Razak then go to flee. They kick and club Eragon again. They also like throw a dagger at him. Brom jumps in front of it and gets stabbed in the side instead.
It
Then
goes between his ribs, a thing that daggers totally do.
when they're aimed at someone else, like
Yeah.
what luck. Then Eragon passes out again. And it's also implied that the Razak do escape. They've been injured but not killed. When Eragon wakes up again, there's a man named Murta, which apparently is pronounced in this book Murtag.
Yeah, it's Murtag.
Murtag treats Eragon's broken ribs because they broke his ribs when they kicked him. And then he and Saphira try to mend Brom's wound, but they can only mend the surface. So is he just like bleeding internally now and going septic?
Yeah, I mean, the dagger went between his ribs, so
Like into his lung, I guess.
no one just dies in this book. Even his uncle like kicked her around for a while.
Well, I guess like because we know that like Brom is a rider, and they do say that like riders are stronger than.
Oh, this is when we find out that Brom's a writer. He's like, I'm dying. You've unlocked my tragic backstory. He's like, go into the water skin into my bag and get my wine skin. And
Yeah.
Aragon's like, now's not a time for drinking. And he's like, do it. So he gets it. And then he rubs his palm and he rubs off the makeup. I don't know. The foundation, the
I think it's
dirt.
like brown ink. Yeah, the foundation.
He wipes the foundation off. And then reveals that he also has the shiny opal palm thing.
Which isn't referenced, isn't like alluded to, like, it's weird that his hands are always dirty, or like Brom has a weird birthmark on his hand, or Brom's always wearing gloves. Never are Brom's hands even thought about by Eragon before this point. That would give you this nice little hint that he is concealing something that Eragon might miss, but you, the reader, are like, I bet he's a rider. I mean, we know he's a rider because he like knows all this stuff about riders. It's just like really clunky.
Yeah, the guy with intimate knowledge of step-by-step rider training was a rider, and we find out that he's not, like, a special rider, he was just one of the, like, the tween riders who was kinda finished with his training, but just starting out with his baby dragon, and the dragon gets killed pretty early in the massacre of all the dragons and the takeover of the empire, but his dragon's name was Saphira too. Oh. Anyway, so he dies.
He dies. He's like, now for my next great adventure. And then he dies. So Murtagh helps take him up, like he carries him up, and then Eragon uses magic to create this sandstone tomb for him, which the next day Saphira turns into a diamond tomb. And later in the book, Murtagh is like, yeah, we had to leave because that is going to be a beacon for everyone who is pursuing you. And Eragon's like, I didn't think of that.
Yeah, I just thought it was weird that they made it into a diamond so he can be preserved for all of mankind to, like, see his face.
Ugly old man face.
I was like, I would not want that. Let me
No.
die without people looking at me. Anyway, now that Brom's dead, Murtagh is now here, so he can't just fly around on Saphira and like make it to the end of the book quicker.
Yeah, Murtagh is described as having like really nice stuff. He has like the nicest clothes and the nicest sword and the nicest bow and the nicest horse. So Aragon's like, I bet he's used to like luxury, even though he just saved his ass from these evil creatures. And Murtagh's like, yeah, I've been hunting the Razak for a while, so I'm gonna just travel with you. And okay.
Yeah, and Eragon's like, dope. I don't know.
Yeah, and he's like, okay. Oh, Eragon also like scratches why me in the sandstone.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. So they leave for Gilead because Brom told Saphira that he has a contact that could get them to the Varden that lives in Gilead. Which, like, why didn't he just tell Eragon?
Oh yeah, it's another thing like, surprise, I'm telling you this information now and not earlier because the plot would move faster than we have to get through all these unnecessary scenes.
Yeah, and the whole time Myrta's like, well, I'll help you get there, but like I don't want to go to the Varden because they're going to arrest me if I go to the Varden. And Eragon doesn't. He's like, why? And Myrta's like, don't worry about it. It's like, obviously he has connections to the Empire. He's wearing really nice clothes, and the group that is against the Empire is gonna arrest him. Obviously he has a connection, but Eragon doesn't even think that that could be an option. He's like, oh, but he's nice, so fine. Anyway, he and Murtagh bond over their interests, which are archery and hunting.
Just bros being guys.
It's and also Eragon's 16th birthday passes. Happy birthday, Eragon. But he doesn't even mention it to Myrta
Because
because
he's too cool for
he's
birthdays.
an edgelord now.
Yeah, he's been through too much. He's like such a different person that left the Shire or whatever town he was actually
He
from.
left Tatooine. And he also mentions that Saphira is like really big now. And she has like real big chompers. Her little like fangs are like the width of his fist. Huge teeth. And they just like hang out of her mouth. She has like these fangs, which I love. I love Saphira.
But she still can't get two people to ride her because I don't know, they gave the horse a really cool name and now they have to ride it for the rest of the book.
Yeah, also Murta has like the bestest horse, even though he's like, that horse that you're riding is really like we know that he comes from like some place that is like well adorned, so he would have access to like the best war horses. And then he's like, but that horse that you found in the middle of nowhere is a close second to my horse. And it's like, how? How did this guy breed this beautiful horse? It's not like this guy is like just a good horse breeder. He just has one really good horse. So weird. Anyway, Myrta and Eragon spar and are so evenly matched that even they get tired at the same time. And even though Eragon has only been practicing for at least, like, or at most, like 3 months, right? And Myrta has been a swordsman his whole life. They're somehow evenly matched. Okay, then they get attacked by Urgles, and one hits Eragon on the head and he passes out. Eragon wakes up in a prison. They have drugged him, so he starts fasting so he can work the drug out of his system because they're drugging the food.
He's not roofied, like it's the drug that stops him from doing magic.
Well, he also kind of describes it as him feeling like really foggy headed. But yeah. Guards pass by. They carry the woman from his dreams. She's followed by the Shade. The Shade then talks to Eragon. Nothing really interesting happens there. He asks Eragon what his true name is, but Eragon doesn't know it's true. You can't tell him.
Gives him a face name. It's like I can't tell if it's bad writing or
It is.
intentional that the Shade is like pulling the wool over his
The Shade
eyes.
doesn't even try to test it. The Shade isn't even like, oh, let me make sure that this is true. And like later in the book, you think that that's going to come up again, where the Shade's like, haha, I can control you really easily by using this name. And then it's revealed that it's not his real, like, true name. But that doesn't happen either, so that makes no sense.
It's a useless scene.
Eragon works the drug out of his system, and then he breaks out just by like moving the locking mechanism on the door, which is like clever. I like that. I would have liked more magic like that. But then is immediately seen by soldiers. So it didn't matter.
It's the funniest scene in the book. Walks out, he's like, I'm free. Looks around, there's like 6 guards coming down. It's like a parody of Guards, because this is what Guards is all about. Popping out of a thing and then 6 guards being like, I don't want to fucking fight the like super magic
Overpowered
dragon dude, but
yeah.
I guess we'll do it. They're like going to fight each other. And then all of a sudden he's like, Saphira, come get me. And then she's like, we're already doing that. And then he's like, what? And then the guards are charging, and then 2 arrows come out of nowhere and pew pew get the guards. And what's that? Martog's here for some reason, and he showed it at the exact right moment. And they defeat the guards, and it's so cool.
Yeah, it made me think that Murta was like a double agent, that he was somehow there at exactly the right moment. That's not the case.
No, he does not have enough personality to be a double agent.
No, he's just like a nice guy.
He's just a plot device who just shows up and is like happy to be here. It's like, I'm happy to kill the right amount of characters to like make.
Yeah, well, Eragon's like, don't kill them. And Murta's like, no, I'm going to kill them. And then he like threatens. That's when he threatens the guard with like the sand, which is so fucked up. Like, that's so much worse than killing someone. But Eragon doesn't even think about how like he gets into this blood rage. Eragon does have an anger problem. He punches multiple walls and trees in the ground when he's angry in multiple parts of the book. It's never really addressed more than that. But anyway, they grab the elf who passes out when they open her cell door, and then they grab their weapons. But before they can leave, the Shade appears and fights Eragon. Myrta hits him in the shoulder and the forehead with an arrow, and he just like disappears. His clothes are there, but he's gone. They're like, yeah, we killed him. Do you think they killed him? No. And then Saphira appears, and they fly away on Saphira. She's having like trouble holding all 3 of them up in the air while arrows are flying around her, but they're able to get to safety. Eragon heals the holes in Saphira's wings from the arrows, and then they just like strap the elf to her back, who's still unconscious and will be unconscious for the 90% of this book, right? Would you say?
I would say of the part of the book that she is in, she's unconscious for 80 to 90% of it.
Yeah, they stop to camp. Eragon heals the elf's wounds, which he has to like take off her clothes, and he's like thinking about how hot she is while he's healing
It's
her
so
wounds.
weird. He's both like, oh, they like these wounds, like because she's got like wounds on her back where she's been like whipped and like burned or whatever. So he's like healing her, and he's like, oh, this is so terrible. And then also he's like, he hot elf shoulder. I don't know.
Yeah, he talks about like how beautiful she is constantly, like her sculpted lips is how he describes her lips multiple times. It's really, really, really creepy how like turned on he is by this unconscious, injured woman.
I mean, he's 60 and it's gross. But you know, it's a PG movie. It's like the grossness it is like very small.
Yeah, especially when like Mert has like 18 and he doesn't seem to be thinking about the elf at all though.
Anything
Like
ever.
yeah, that's true. They enter a desert by crossing a river.
The
Do
river
you
crossing scene is so funny. It's just like it's so useless. It's just like, and then the dragon picks one person and takes them over, and then and it's
do
like,
you
all
want
right,
to talk
cool.
about how angry it made you?
Oh yeah, so this whole book, we've been on horseback. So much of this book is on horseback, and it's taking forever. And Sephora is so much faster than these horses. Like she flies off leagues away.
Sephora at the makeup store, yeah.
Sorry. Saphira, sorry. Saphira is like so much faster than these horses and could get us where we want to go. Literally, I think she could fly to the places they want to go, drop a person off, come back at the other person. But she doesn't do that because they got these really cool horses. And then also, she can't carry multiple people. And then here she is at this river crossing, picking up these draft horses or these war horses, which are definitely more than two teenagers.
Didn't you Google this?
Yes. Okay. So what I Googled for this book is how much does a horse weigh? And it's 800 to 2,000 pounds.
And these are war horses, so they probably be at the heavier end.
They'd be pretty heavy. And the reason we can't fly everywhere is because Saphira can't carry two humans on her back.
And an elf, yeah.
Well, at this point, and an elf. And I'm just like doing the math, and I'm like, so this horse is got to be like, we're going to say 1,200 pounds, right?
Sure.
Like a good in the middle of that.
Yeah, but also not just the horse, all of the supplies that the horse has on it,
Mm-hmm.
all of the tack that the horse has on it, which is going to make it a lot heavier.
Yeah, Corey's probably carrying a couple hundred pounds. Lower range, 1,200 pounds. Eragon, as a 16-year-old, at most. This is like, I'm being so generous and he's so big and so strong, 180 pounds. Murtagh, I'm going to be so generous. Like, if he was the biggest boy, he'd probably be like 220 based on his description. There's no way this elf weighs more than 120 pounds soaking wet. Together, they do not make one horse. They just can't. Why can't we just fly? Why can't we just fly Saphira? It's the freaking like eagles.
Because then they'd all have to like spoon each other.
I know. It's just this.
It would be cute though. They could stay warm. It would make more sense though if he was like riding with. So the elf's name is Arya. We find this out later. It would make more sense though if he was riding with Arya like unconscious, leaning against him, because right now she's just flopping around. It's so absurd. They just like stick her on the horse and they stick her on Saphira. And like we know from Aragon's first flight on Saphira that it's pretty traumatic when you don't know what you're doing. And she's literally unconscious, so she doesn't have any control. And the saddle that they make only straps your legs to.
They eventually make something new to tire.
Yeah. But it's days before they do that. And when they put her on the horse, because they still sometimes put her on the horse, she's just flopping around on the horse.
I love that our two different pet peeves are combining together, which is like there's so much unnecessary weird travel in it, and they should just fly the frickin' dragon. Save us so much time.
Yeah, they have a dragon with them the whole time, and they never use her to get somewhere faster. Anyway, they've crossed the river. The scene does, though, kind of remind me of the scene from The Dragon Prince when Sinead is crossing the river. I don't think he took it from this, but like it just reminded me of that. And Saphira really, really likes the desert, which also reminded me of Dragon Prince. She's just like, I feel like I was made for this place. I love it so much. I love how warm it is. And I was like, yeah, like the Dragon Prince. But I don't think he like took.
There's no way he read that book. Yeah.
No, that book would not be appropriate for him at 15 also. Murta also hates the desert. He does not like sand, and he gets so grumpy. And he's like, I don't want to go to the Varden. And he keeps saying, like, I don't want to go to the Varden. And Eragon's like, no, like, just travel with us a little bit further. And he's like, okay, fine, I will. Which makes also no sense.
They should split up right here. He goes with the dragon to the Varden or wherever, and Murtagh gives them a fond farewell. But nope, they're still together for absolutely no reason.
No reason other than that Murta, I guess, needs to go to the Varden for plot reasons. Maybe he's just like a huge pushover. He does say at one point to Eragon that Eragon needs like a babysitter, which is kind of true. Like he would have died without someone there helping him.
Yeah, I mean, Murtagh shows up twice to like literally shoot arrows into the person who's trying to kill him. Which it would be really interesting if Murtagh was like, "You're such this baby boy, and you're so important. I feel like I need to like protect you, and that's why I'm here." Murtagh does not give a reason why he's hanging out with him at all.
Anyway, they get through the desert. It's not eventful. Then they get a little snippy with each other. They finally realize that like they should give water to the elf. Like, days later, they also decide that they're going to wrap her up in a blanket like a cigar and then strap her to Saphira's belly like a baby Bjorn. Which, oh my god. Anyway, they get to the mountains on the other side of the desert, which are the Bior Mountains, and they're huge. So think the Himalayas, but also the Misty Mountains, because this is where all the dwarves live. Eragon finally thinks, maybe I should try to telepathically connect with the elf. He also tries to do that with Murta. He tries to like read his mind. He's like, oh, I can't do that. His mind is like locked down. But then he tries to communicate with the elf, and she says, oh, my name is Arya, and I'm in hibernation mode because I was poisoned, and I am trying to keep the poison from killing me.
Also, at first, she tries to squash his mind like a little bug.
Yeah.
And only through him begging and telling in like the language that you can't lie and that like, no, I'm a friend, please don't kill me. She's like, all right, I'm not going to immediately kill you, which is a great scene.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, you're right. Anyway, she's like, the only antidote is either at the Varden or with the elves, but the elves are too far away, so your only option is to go to the Varden. And again, Murta's like, I'll like get you most of the way there, but I'm not going to go to the Varden, but doesn't say why. The Urgles are then pursuing them when they are attacked by slavers. Murta kills one of them, and that really upsets Eragon for no reason. And Murta's like, he was going to kill us. And Eragon's like, that doesn't matter. He was unarmed. And Murta's like, should I have given him a sword? I'm a better swordsman than he was. Like, it would have still been uneven. And Eragon's like, I don't know. You could have let him go. He was about to give up. And Murta's like, he would have told the Urgles where we were going. Those other people who escaped will tell the Urgles where we're going. And Eragon's like, no, you should never kill people. But this is a slaver. Like, he's destroyed the lives of so many people. It's like...
And Eragon, and there's a scene where there's like a slave auction. He's like, this is evil. I must get vengeance on this. It's just, it's like totally a weird scene.
And yeah, it's like this moral objectivity. And I think it's trying to show that Murta is more morally gray, but it doesn't work.
Yeah, because Saphira takes Murtagh's side and is
Yeah,
like...
also, like, while he's fighting with Murta, this is so fun. This made me laugh out loud. Saphira's like, he decapitates the guy. And Saphira is sniffing the head while he's arguing with Murtagh. And then she opens her mouth like she's gonna eat it. And then she's like, no, I shouldn't. Which is like, what the fuck, Saphira?
Nothing in this scene makes sense. Sorry.
No, it doesn't. Anyway, they are continued to be pursued by the Urgles throughout the mountain, and Saphira and Eragon like try to fly really high so they can kind of see the lay of the land. But Saphira takes Eragon too high and he passes out. Saphira mentions when he comes to that this might come in handy later. It never comes up again. They learn that the Urgles are actually Kull, Kull, or fighting Urukai, if you would rather. Saphira and Eragon then start dropping boulders on them, which Eragon doesn't seem to have a problem with the fact that they're killing like multiple Urgles at a time, even though he just had that huge argument with Murta about it, which is confusing. He doesn't even think about it. He doesn't even think like, well, this is different. There's no thought in his head. Murta again says that he doesn't want to go to the Varden, and then he admits why, which is that he's Morzan's son, which surprises none of us. He also says that the sword that Eragon is using, that was the Dragon Rider sword, is actually Morzan's sword. And he like pulls up his shirt, and there's like a huge scar on his back from his shoulder to his opposite hip. That is when Morzan threw the sword at him when he was a child and hit him in the back and cut his back, and he almost died from it. So, and Eragon's like, oh shit. And then Morzan's like, so if I go to the Varden, they're going to arrest me. But he also says that like Brom killed Morzan, which is how he has the sword, which is true. That's how it happened. Anyway, they get to the entrance of the Varden, but the Urgles reach them just as they get there, and they're like banging on the walls and they're like saying the keyword. And then Saphira's suddenly like, we're on the lake. It's just trying to create more drama, but it's not working. So then they jump into this waterfall to get to the right side, but Eragon gets pulled under. And a dwarf actually fishes Eragon out, and the dwarf's name is Auric, which we learn later. When Eragon's pulled out of the water, a bald man is holding a dagger to Myrta's throat and tells them that they all need to get inside. And then when they get inside, the dwarf convinces the bald man to let Arya be taken to a healer. Because Eragon's like, she needs to be healed. She's poisoned. And the bald man's like, no, we have to test you. And then the dwarf is like, but that's Arya, the egg bearer. So then they carry off Arya. Then the bald man tests Eragon's intentions by digging through his mind. Saphira is able to help him keep some things away from the bald guy, which such as like how many words of power he knows. Also that Myrta is Morzan's son, which it doesn't actually seem to matter because the next scene it's found out that he's Morzan's son. And then he does try the same thing on Myrta, but Myrta doesn't let him in. And then the dwarf stops him from trying, and he gets really pissed about that. So they put them all in their cell, and then Myrta's like, let me tell you my life story. Do you want to talk about it?
Murtaugh's life story. I mean, it's just like it's like not a good life story for like kind of the character that he is. It's just like he grew up in his dad's house and his dad sucked, see giant scar on back. But then his dad died like what, like 10 years ago or something? And then he seemed to like just live as like a nobleman in an evil empire.
Yeah.
And his
Well, he didn't
mom
realize that the Empire was evil because when Galbatorix like called him to him, he's like, I have this vision for the Empire, which I explained earlier. And he's like, yeah, that sounds great.
It's sort of unclear what his politics are, in the way that it's unclear what anyone in this entire book's politics are, except for Gabinatorix, which is he wants to rule the world and be evil while doing it.
I mean, it seems like he's like kind of mentally unstable because like Myrta says like he painted this beautiful idyllic vision of the future for me, and then the next time I was called to him he told me that I have to go destroy this entire town because it wasn't like a good reason, but he was like, they are traitors, you have to kill every single person. And Myrta is like, oh shit, he's just like off the rails.
Yeah, he's like a bad guy act. Yeah, we also find out that Murtagh's
He's like a little Zuko. I don't think
yeah, he's very Zuko coded
he's like very, very Zuko.
with the scar and everything, though he's like less cool power wise. The other important thing is so Morzan is the only one of the dragon riders that like met a woman, and it's like it's not like they like fell in love.
She falls in love with him, and then but he doesn't know how to love, so he just like uses her love against her to control her.
So she loves him and he uses her in like court to like, I don't know, spy or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they have the kid, which is him. And then she vanishes for like 6 to 8 months for who knows why. And then she comes back and immediately kicks it.
Yeah, and then she's like sick when she comes back.
Which is just such a funny dead mom immediately falls over. Just like, we got to kill this mom real quick. But yeah, so that's Murtagh's tragic backstory, which of course we had to wait until the last conceivable moment to express. He's just such a weird character.
And all at once. We don't slowly understand his like none of these characters are like you're slowly being like it's revealed to you their story. It's like I'm gonna sit you down and tell you.
Really, so he also is like it's like, oh, I can't go to the rebels, not because I'm like super diametrically opposed, though I do think that like the empire has some good ideas. This like one dude, it's like, I think we should live in an empire, but like maybe not this one. And it's like, what? No. And he's like, but
like, I believe in the empire, I just don't believe in the person who rules it.
Yeah,
like,
it's
interesting.
But I'm like, but also, isn't that sort of true about the other people? Because don't they just want to install a different Dragon Rider empire? It's unclear what the rebels want.
Yeah, like Ajihad when he okay, well we'll get to the next scene because Ajihad does say like I think it's the Dwarf King asks Eragon like, well, what are your plans? And he's like, would you rule and Galbatorix stay? And And Aragon's like, no, I don't want to do that. And then whoever he's talking to is like, good, because you're immortal and an immortal person shouldn't rule. Which, like, maybe.
Doors last pretty long, just saying.
Yeah, and like elves too. Also dragons. Like, do they not have any kind of hierarchical society where the dragons live?
Politics are weird.
They the next day they come, like the bald guy comes and they process them like through the do you want to explain this? It's called Farthendur. This was another place where I was like, I kind of understand what this place looks like, but I kind of don't.
I have no idea what this place looks like. For some reason, in the mountain, so they go into the mountain and everything is big enough for a dragon to go through for some reason, even though everyone here is a dwarf.
Well, they're humans too, but
Sure, but full-grown dragon-sized is like fine. Like
well, they have
Sephora's
like dragon headquarters, so it must have been a place where dragon riders stayed.
but almost every tunnel is big enough for a dragon. So they
Yeah.
like walk through this giant tunnel that's like, I don't know, like a mile. They say it's like a league, whatever that is, long.
They interchange league and miles.
So they walk down this long ass tunnel that's dragon sized, and then they get into this chamber.
A league is way longer than a mile.
Okay.
So just so you know. Sorry.
Yeah.
Continue.
How many leagues in a mile? How many miles in a league?
It's 700 or 7,500 feet. I think it's what it says. Hold on. It says it ranges from 2.4 to 4.6 miles.
It's 3.5 miles. So basically they do a 5K.
Varying lengths from 7,500 to 15,000 feet.
Okay, so a league is about a 5K. So they walk a 5K
You can cut that
to
out.
get from the waterfall entrance to the inside of this like mountain, which is really a dormant volcano that has this like huge antechamber that's got a whole city in it. But the city is like levels.
Yeah, the city is a mountain in the middle of it, though. And then there's like all this land around it.
And there's a slide, and then there's
There's a curly slide in the city that's in the middle of this dome.
there's up somewhere, there's like dragon headquarters, and then down somewhere there's like more stuff.
There's giant icicles at the top of the crater hole, too.
That maybe fall down and hurt people.
Yeah, they're like, when they fall, they could split a horse, which is terrifying.
It's a
Why?
Yeah, so it's a weird there's a lot of descriptions for it, and I just couldn't hold any of it in my mind.
It wasn't well described. It was described in such a way that I was just like, I think I understand what this is, but it was confusing. Anyway, there's like a huge crowd of people on the procession from where they exit this tunnel to the mountain that's in the middle of this crater. And like Aragon's like super awkward, where he's on Saphira and he like waves and then like no one responds. So then he kind of like just puts his hand down and it's still quiet. And then one person cheers and then everyone cheers for him. But then the dwarves are like turning their backs to him. And then they get to the mountain where they meet Ajihad, who is the leader of the Varden. And he immediately recognizes Myrta from his voice. He's like, I've heard that voice before. And Myrta's like, yeah, I'm his son.
Which is not how voices work. That's not how voices work.
No. And then he's like straight to jail. So he takes him to a cell. Then he like exposits to Eragon for a while. He puts Auric, the dwarf, in charge of Eragon's needs. We also learn that the bald man is a twin and that neither of them have names, and they've never had names. And Eragon, who constantly is asking why, doesn't ask why here. And I want to know why. And it bothered the crap out of me for the rest of the book. Anyway.
These twins, I was like, oh, good. A new character that's obviously evil that we're just going to have to pretend isn't evil until their dramatic reveal, even though they're so obviously evil.
Yeah, it's a children's book, but yeah, it's like, come on. Saphira is told that she's able to pick out any room that she wants from the dragon hold, which is at the very peak of this mountain. And then while she's doing that, Auric takes Eragon to eat and bathe, which is, I think, the first time he's bathed. And then he exposits as well. Saphira comes down to take Eragon up to the hold, and a woman asks Eragon to bless the orphan child in her hands, and he does. And then Saphira touches her forehead with her nose, and that causes a starburst to form on her head. And everyone's like, ooh, amazing. And then they go up to the hold. Then the Weircat appears. Remember Solemn Bum?
Oh,
Yeah.
I love it so much. It's just like, I'm back. And I'm like, why were you in there the first place? But you're back now?
Also, how did you get there so fast? Anyway, yeah. And Eragon is taken by the Weircat to visit Angela, who is currently hiding from the twins because she doesn't want to join their order. But she's there.
Angela feels like a character from a different book whose like magic system is different, so she could
Yeah.
just kind of like wander around and do whatever she wants in it.
Oh, her magic is based in like herbs and potions and plants. But when Brahm is like listing the different kinds of magic users in the world earlier in the book, he doesn't say that that's a form, which is odd. And like we have this huge exposition that is given to us from Brahm, where he's like, you could be this or this or this or this, and that this isn't one of them. So like, why was that just left out? Why didn't he just say like some of them are good with plants and potions? And then we meet one. It's like, oh, cool, that's how that works. The next day, Aragon is taken to meet the Dwarf King, who exposits some more. This is when we get that interaction where he's like, "Would you be the king?" And Aragon's like, "No." He mentions that the throne isn't intentionally uncomfortable. He's like, "This throne is uncomfortable for a reason, to show the discomfort of kings," which is literally from Game of Thrones, but Game of Thrones like does it more subtly, where like whenever the person's sitting on the throne, they're like thinking about how uncomfortable it is, the throne that's made of all the melted swords. And I kind of feel like he lifted that, but he, like everything in this book, it's not shown, it's told.
Oh, I just felt like this was like the most American way of thinking about a monarchy you can, which is like, yeah, you should kings shouldn't live forever, even though they should be given absolute power for some reason, and throne is uncomfortable because
Yeah, I
of
don't know. I think it was a Game of Thrones reference, but I think it could be
is
too
Game of
soon.
Thrones?
Yeah,
When did Game of Thrones come out?
the 90s.
Ah.
Auric then takes him to a library, which, like, again, he learned to read 1 week, 3 months ago. And he's like, "Ooh, I would love to see the library." And it's this beautiful library. I think it was like an author wish fulfillment thing where he would like this library to exist. And Aragon just spends the whole day browsing. He doesn't read anything. He doesn't like look, he's not like looking for something that's like, oh, this could be helpful or this could be helpful. He just like is reading a poetry book from one of the random dwarf kings when he's approached by the twins and they're like, "Hey, we want you to join our magical order." And Aragon's like, "They just want to learn the words of magic that I know." And they're like, "Well, you have to have an answer for us tomorrow, or we'll make things really unpleasant for you." It's like, then he returns to the Dragonhold. Ajihad's daughter is there, and she's like, "Hey, Ajihad said like don't provoke the twins. Also, you can go visit Murta if you want." The next day, he goes to the arena to be tested in combat because they really just want to see like what his skill level is, like how much Brahm was able to teach him. So you need to test him in combat and in magic. But the twins appear and they're like, "We're going to test you with magic." And they're like, "Are you going to join our order?" And he's like, "No." And then they intentionally try to sabotage him throughout the entire test. So they like ask him to pick up a stone, but he can feel them pushing the stone down. So it's harder for him to pick it up. And they ask him like increasingly difficult questions. So he's trying to use the simplest words that he can so that they can't learn any new words to perform the tasks that they give him. And then in the end, they ask him to find the like essence of silver. And Aragon's like, "I don't know what that means, but okay." But as he's like trying to figure it out, Arya appears and is like, "Stop!" And then she is like, "He's passed your test. Be gone." And then she casts a spell herself to create the essence of silver. And then she like, "That was like a master's spell, and you wouldn't have been able to do it." Which sure. And then she's like, "I'm going to spar with you now." And he's like, "I don't want to spar because I'm really tired from using all that magic." But then, even though she's like 1,000 years old and he's been fighting for 6 months at the most, he's able to hold his own with her for like a long time.
Also, elves have super strength because there's so many
And super
chapters
speed.
throughout this book where it's like so clear that the author has a hard on for elves because they're just like the best, shiniest, goodest. They're the smartest, the fastest, the most magical. They're like
Yeah.
so great and cool.
He does eventually lose, but then like everyone is like cheering and it's like, and like this one warrior is like, "I learned some new moves from you. You did such a great job," because everyone is always constantly praising him.
Even in defeat, he's the bestest, smartest, goodest boy that's ever been a good boy.
Yeah, and she's like, "You passed." And he's like, "How did I pass? I lost to her." But like, how could he pass? They're just trying to evaluate what level he's at. So he couldn't fail or pass. This isn't a pass fail thing. This is just like okay, how much do you know? So I don't even understand why they were using those words. And then she's like, "Hey, I want to speak with you over there." And so he gets on Saphira. Doesn't like get her on Saphira. He just gets on Saphira. Underneath them, she's just like full sprinting towards this hill, which is so Weird. And Saphira's like, I think you like her. And he's like, well, she's pretty. And she's like, I think she has a horse face. And he's like, Saphira, are you jealous? And Saphira's like, no, I'm not jealous. And he's like, yeah, you are, which is also really weird. She's a dragon. What? Like, what? It's so. And then Arya just meets with him to like kind of tell him what happened when she was with the Shade, which isn't important at all. Like, we don't learn anything.
Yeah, she's like, by the way, I was tortured. And we're like, yeah, we know.
We know that. And, like, it doesn't seem like she gave up any information. So, like, it would've made more sense if she's like, "Look, they know where the Varden is because I gave that up." But she doesn't say that. So, anyway, he goes to see Myrta, who's, like, in the cell that has, like, a writing desk, and he's like, they've been giving me, like, all these books from the library." And he's, like, really happy.
Yeah, he's so down for prison. He's like, at first I thought it would suck, but actually it's kind of cool. I get to hang out in this nice room and read books.
And they feed me as much as I want.
And the ruler of the rebellion's hot daughter is here, and like that's fun. It's so weird.
Yeah,
It's
he
so
really
weird.
seems like he has a crush on the daughter of, Ajihad's daughter, and he's, like, really happy, and Eragon's, like, really disturbed by this.
Mert seems like he's pretty comfortable living under other people's rules as long as it's cushy. He's like, another gilded cage? Sign me up.
Yeah, he's like, "I could stay here forever. I'd never have to deal with my evil, like, kind of adopted uncle ever again." Eragon is then woken in the middle of the night because there's an attack. The Urgles have found their way into the tunnels, which seems like it's completely unconnected to the fact that they led the Urgles all the way to the edge of the Varden.
Yeah, they murdered all those Urgles, but like those Urgles were supposed to meet up with these Urgles who were like already there. There's so much of like we gotta be real careful so nobody sees us, and then it's like, oh, that didn't like they figured it out anyway, and nothing we did mattered. Cool, that's great storytelling.
But it also feels like we did nothing wrong. It would have been better if it was like, "Oh shit, we led them here." Or like again, like Arya's like, "Yeah, they're gonna be here in a few days because I did let something slip or they got into my mind or whatever." But no, none of that happened. It's like just a random attack. This is like the last 12 pages of the novel too, so it's like, "What?"
Yeah, when they started the like umpteenth training montage with like 40 pages to go, I was like, what are we doing here? Where is the climax?
They asked Aragon and Arya to collapse strategic tunnels with magic so that they can kind of funnel the Urgles into specific openings and kill them. And so he goes to do that. Oric also gives him and Saphira armor. The battle starts. The twins are giving telepathic information to Aragon about where he needs to be, and he's then also giving them information. And he's like just moving around. Angela is fighting with like this double-sided sword staff. Murta also was released so that he can fight, and he's like fine with it.
Yeah, he's like, hey, they trust me now. And I'm like, no, what? Why?
And Aragon's like, what happened to you being afraid that someone's gonna recognize you and try to pick a fight with you? And he's like, no one's gonna notice me now.
Yeah, God, this whole fight's so dumb because they blow up a bunch of tunnels to like force them into a couple of big tunnels. And then that works, but then there's just a ton of them. So they overrun their defenses. And I'm like, you should be able to kill more of them. It should have been easier for them to like
Yeah.
cut people down and like block this entrance
Yeah, these
way.
also are all warriors that are there. Like they like remove all the women and children, which also would not happen in a siege. Women and children in actual sieges would have been standing on high places throwing rocks down at the people who were entering the city. Or like any non-fighter is actually what I mean, like old people too. They would like you'd think they would have placed them like on the walls so they could just like throw rocks down on the Urgles as they appear, but no.
Anyway, there's an unyielding torrent of like,
Yeah, just like waves of
yeah.
infinite orcs, or sorry, Urgles. Anyway, the twins then tell Aragon telepathically that the Urgles have made their way underneath into the tunnels that are underneath the mountain city that's in the middle of the crater, and that Aragon and Arya need to come collapse them. So they fly on Saphira. They're able to fly on Saphira this time without an issue. Saphira can carry them, but Saphira like gets hit by an Urgle, so her breastplate gets crushed, and then like she can't like move around very well. So Arya's like, Eragon, you go and collapse the tunnel. I'll pull her breastplate off, which doesn't make sense for two reasons. Number one, Arya is the better fighter and magic user, so she should be the one to collapse the tunnel. Number two, it's not her dragon. So why did Aragon go instead of Arya?
I can answer that question because earlier in the book they set up a death slide that sounded super cool, and Aragon has to go down the death slide. That's why.
But Arya could have gone down the
No,
death
no, no,
slide.
I'm sorry. It was specifically like someone who is bigger than a dwarf. It could be potentially deadly, and as an elf, she'd be super graceful and would not succumb to the death slide. So Aragon has to go down the death slide. It's foreshadowing. Have you heard of Chekhov's gun? It's the sort of like
Okay.
Chekhov's gun, but it's Chekhov's death slide. That's why.
All right, Chekhov's loaded luge. So Aragon does the luge all the way down to the bottom with his slide because he's like, there's no other way to get down there fast enough. And he's like, huh, the twins aren't here. And then he's like, huh, no one's here. And then a bunch of Urgles appear. And
Oh,
then
actually, it's very important. He does survive the death slide, even though they say it's super dangerous. He's got it.
he's fine the whole time. There's not even a question. Yeah, because he's that good at sliding, at being on a slide. Um, at the curly slide, he's a master. The shade appears, and he realizes he doesn't actually seem to realize that this is a trap that was laid by the twins.
No, he's still like, "Where's the twins? Huh, that's so weird."
And then the shade's like, "Hee, I've got you now. I'm going to take you. Where's your dragon?" And Aragon's like, "I'll never tell you," even though she's on the other side of the glass ceiling that we're underneath, and you can probably see her feet. He fights the shade, and the shade tries to like get into his mind, but then Aragon like fights back, and then he sees like all the shade's memories.
The shade gets into his mind, like, he has not but, like, maybe he's in the shade's mind, unclear.
Well, we learn the shade's tragic backstory because we learn everybody's tragic backstory in this book.
Honestly, insane nonsense. Purely cut out of it. I thought this is like one of the better things in the later half where you have the fight scene and then you have a glimpse of tragic backstory and then you are like, you're back to fighting and then a glimpse of a tragic backstory. And this could be good if anything else around it had been good.
The fight scene was described better because I feel like I didn't know what the fuck was going on.
Yeah, it's a lot of like, and then I swipe through and then we shoot an arrow and you're just like, where are people in space?
Yeah, and then the shade like slashes him across the back with the shade sword.
Which so he's facing him.
Yeah, I don't
They
know.
talk about them facing him, and then they, like, cut to the tragic backstory, and then there's some more fighting exposition, then we cut to the tragic backstory, and then he's slashing him around the back, and I'm like, "Where did he get behind him?" He was facing him, like, earlier in this page.
Anyway, so he's like, I'm dying. And then suddenly Arya on Saphira's back break through the glass ceiling and are coming down towards, and Saphira breathes fire for the first time. And then Aragon is able to take advantage of this because the shade is distracted and stabs the shade through the heart, which is the only way to kill a shade. And he dies. And then Aragon passes out.
Yeah, he, like, turns into, like, 3 blankets and, like, vanishes.
Or spirits, yeah.
Spirits. It's sort of described as, like, 3 cloths or something. Like, he, like, splits into and then just, like, whoosh.
Yeah, but those are like the spirits that were inhabiting his body that were making him a shade. Well, anyway, so Aragon's like unconscious and he's like battling these dark thoughts, and it's kind of like a quite like, is he becoming a shade? It's kind of confusing. Like maybe he was like tainted by the dark side. Then he hears a voice that's like, I'm holding back the pain, but you have to come to me with Arya and I will teach you how to control it. And Aragon's like, okay. And he's like, I am the morning sage, the cripple that is whole, which, oof, what a name. That is not ableist language. Definitely not. I just like, it's almost like disgusting, like offensive. What does that mean? The cripple that is whole, like other cripple people aren't whole because they have like a body issue. What?
Yeah, he also, I feel like, has a sort of Asian sounding name and is described in a bunch of robes. And I was just like, oh no.
Yeah, he's a bad kind of stereotype. Morning also in morning stage is the morning with a U, not like the time of day. Then Aragon wakes up, the battle is over. He is with Angela and she calls in Arya, Myrta, and Saphira, and then they tell him that after the shade died, the Urgles all turned on each other because they were no longer under the power of the shade. And then the battle was over within minutes. And people are still like trying to hunt down the Urgles that escaped through the tunnels. And Aragon's like, oh, I have this huge scar on my back that looks exactly like the scar on Myrta's back. And Myrta's like, hey, we match now. And then the book ends.
Yeah. Well, he's like, I guess I gotta go talk to that sage. But yeah, that's the end of the book.
So, yeah, yeah. Anyway, that's the book. So I think you probably, dear listener, know from listening to us that we're probably not going to read Eldest, which I actually wanted to mention that I loved Eragon when I was a kid. It was really an important book for me. I actually thought I was going to like this book rereading it, even if it was bad. I was like expecting to get really defensive over it because of how important it was to me when I was a kid. And that was not the case. But I do just want to mention that Eldest was the first book that I ever read that I intentionally decided I didn't want to finish reading. Like other books I had not finished reading because I like, set them down and then kind of forgot about them. And then I was like, oh, I'd have to restart them. And then like I didn't. But Eldest was the first book I was like, this is just not well written and I don't want to finish reading it. So I can't imagine how much worse it must be if I thought that this was good when I was a kid. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's not a good book.
Yeah, and like that is to say, like, if you liked this book, that's totally fine. If you like read this book like we did when you were a kid and you loved it and you haven't read it in a while and you're like, well, I have a really good memory of that and I remember really liking it. Same, me too. And that's fine too. And if you were like, well, I read it a year ago and I really liked it, also fine. You're allowed to like something. Just because we didn't like it doesn't mean that you're wrong. It doesn't mean that you have a bad opinion. It just means that we had a different opinion than you, and that's okay. And you're allowed to like it, and you're allowed to like the whole series. I kind of like just looked at the plot for the rest of the series because I'm not going to read it, and it seems like it gets really dark. What do you have any other thoughts?
Nah, I think we gotta talk about dragons now. It's dragon time.
All right, dragon time. How did you like the? Let me go to the dragon section of my notes. Oh, Aragon faints 7 times throughout this book, in case you were wondering.
7 times. Me and Joe were keeping count, and it's honestly incredible. We're just like, he can't be fainting again. And we're like, there's a lot of tropes in this book. We could talk about tropes if you want to talk about tropes now instead of dragons.
Sure. Yeah, so I think I already talked about the hero's journey enough. We also have the trope of the mentor slash sage slash hermit, which is Brahm. Aragon is obviously a chosen one. He's also portrayed as like the special chosen one, which is extra chosen because he masters everything immediately. It would have been nice if this book, like, maybe he was really good at magic and he was really good at swordplay, but he just couldn't. Reading was really hard for him, and that really frustrated him. Like, even though reading isn't really important to this book, the fact that he would have like one thing that he wasn't good at and he's not used to having things that he's not good at, that would have really rounded out his character in a way. That would have been nice, but the book didn't do that. And I really think that this was a lot of wish fulfillment for the author.
Yeah.
Because Aragon is constantly being praised for how inquisitive he is, how talented he is, how fast he picks things up, which is something that when you're that age you really want and you really value when an adult tells you that. And they're constantly telling him this. No one is ever like, I just don't like you, unless they're portrayed as evil or bad in the case of Sloane or like the twins.
You can really see why this book appeals to children because it's just like someone racking up wins all the time and being told he's the specialist boy.
Yeah. And he's more special than the other special boys. Like, he's more special than other dragon riders. Like, when he first scries Arya in his dream, and then when he scries her after he's awake and she looks at him, you're like, oh, Arya must be doing something to try to connect with him. But then when he talks to Arya in the end of the book, she's like, oh, I kind of thought someone was like looking at me at some points, but like I didn't do it. That wasn't me. So it must just be that you're powerful. And it would have worked so much better if she was like, yeah, I was really trying to reach out and find someone to help me.
Yeah. A thing that I both enjoyed and also found annoying, depending on how far into the book I got, was I appreciated that this book is just tropes on top of tropes on top of tropes. So even the tropes when they tended to annoy me, like fainting at the end of scenes, I thought was kind of funny because it's just
Mhm.
like throw another trope on the pile. And it's
Yeah.
just got a bunch of them. Do you want to go through all the tropes you like laid out? Because I think they're pretty good.
I'm sure that I missed a bunch, but we also have the damsel in distress, which is Arya, who has to be rescued. We have a manic pixie dream girl, which is Angela. Red eyes mean evil. The shades have red eyes. That's a trope. The others, like the dwarves, elves, and humans, are in the Lord of the Rings tradition, which is a big trope. The Dragon Rider's order is basically Pern. So it's based on that Pern tradition, which becomes a trope as well in other dragon books. This is kind of the first book that we read where we're seeing the other books that we read in it, which is kind of nice, I have to say. Like, it was like, that's Pern. Oh, that's Earthsea.
Mhm.
We have an evil army of non-humans, so we don't have to feel bad about killing them because this is a children's book, which are the Urgles. We have a word-based magic system, which is based on Earthsea. We have the Aragorn stand-in, which is Murta, though reading further into into the synopsis of the next book, he does diverge from Aragorn there. He has a hard time, apparently, in the future books, which makes me not want to read it.
Oh no, they should have let him just hang out in that cell. He was having so much fun.
I know, with the pretty princess. Yeah, he
Yeah.
apparently I'm going to say a huge spoiler for the next book. So if you don't want to hear that spoiler, stop listening. He apparently gets captured by Galbatorix, and Galbatorix has him bond one of the dragon eggs, so he hatches a dragon, so he gets a dragon, but then he learns his true name, and so Galbatorix controls him for the rest of the series and forces him to do horrible things, like kill people, torture people, lead armies against the Varden because he can't say no because he knows his true name. So he's just tortured for the rest of the series, which is terrible. Eragon is the innocent archetype. He's also the hero archetype, and he's also the orphan archetype. We have Deus Ex Machina with Murta twice. And then the Razak are basically the Nazgul from Lord of the Rings. Sorry, going back to Murta for a second. Murta is going to be his foil, right? He's
Yeah.
the opposite side of the coin, especially since they have those matching scars, which is another trope. We have also the fated love interest, which is Arya.
Mhm. So
Yes, I'm sure I'm missing even more, but
let's talk about dragons because there's a bunch of good
yeah.
dragon tropes in there that we could move on.
This, I think, is the first book that I was like, this is the right amount of dragon.
You're right.
In the
Yeah.
in the other books, I was like, I still would like more dragon. This was the right amount. There was a good amount of dragon in this book. Well, I
Yeah.
don't know. Do you agree?
So there's one dragon, but she's all over it. And I
Yeah.
think that's great. She's a very dragony dragon.
She has the most personality of all the characters in the book. Is her. Like, she's the one that I feel like I understood her character the most,
Yeah.
and she wasn't just doing what the plot needed, even though she did sometimes do just what the plot needed.
Yeah. Of all of the one-dimensional characters, she had a second dimension. You are not wrong. Yeah, I mean, what I liked about her, first off, she sounds beautiful. I like that she's blue. Because
I
usually,
like that she has fangs. So
yeah,
cute.
usually it's like red or gold or whatever. So like the blue's a nice touch. I like the fangs. I like the spikes on her back that she's got like a built-in spot for like a dude to hang out on her.
Yeah. So you also know exactly where he's sitting. I think that was a question we had when we were reading Pern, like, are they on the dragon's necks? Are they on the dragon's backs? Because
Mhm.
it kind of was described both ways in Pern, but we know exactly where the dragon rider is sitting on the dragon.
Yeah, not a lot of dragon husbandry, but like just some egg action, which is I think nice.
Yeah, we don't learn how dragons have sex in this book, which is
One of the few.
one of the few somehow, which is nice. I appreciated not knowing that. We also know that she has 4 legs. She has a really long tail. She has membranous bat-like wings that are huge, that are quite large. I like that they talk about how big her wings have to be in order
Mhm.
for her to fly. She really seems very sinuous and snake-like too. Like, she's very long and thin. She's not like bulky in the middle. I don't know if that's the correct read, but that's how I envisioned her, which I really liked. She was great. I like the dragon.
Ever since Guards, I've been thinking about how impossible it is for something that big to be that like sturdy and fly. Like, so the heaviest bird in the world is like 33 pounds. So, heavy things aren't flying in real words. And like, I know a wizard did it, magic is real. But I think it's cool when we bring that like heft into things. I originally liked that it was cool that she couldn't carry much past her own weight. Even as she grows, she's growing with it. So her flight is her plus what she can conceivably carry that's prey.
Your issue with that isn't that that was the rule. Your issue with that is that they broke the rule with the horses. Like, it would have been fine if she was like, I can't carry the horses across. They're too heavy, but she's
Mhm.
able to do it. And that breaks this rule that has been established, which is a major plot point.
I think it could make sense that if she could like as she gets older, she could maybe carry a horse because that sounds like something that would be a prey animal.
Yeah. Which is what the dragons eat the horses in The Dragon Prince.
Yeah, my problem with her being able to carry a horse, but not 3 people, is that they just wanna, like, ride horses for the whole book, and that's why they don't take her.
Also, the way that they ride horses is, like, ridiculous. These horses never rest. They're constantly going full speed on these horses even at night, and
Yeah, they're riding them like cars.
yeah, they're cars. And it's like, how are these horses not dead? They should be dead. You have killed your horse. You aren't taking care of Snowfire, Aragon. Yeah. Yeah, but anyway, back to the horse or back to the dragons. Yeah, I think when she takes off, you really feel like the weight of her taking off. Like it describes the way she jumps into the air.
Yeah, they talk about her digging into the grass and leaving, like, back claw prints in the dirt because she pushes off with such ferocity. It's
Mhm.
cool. So I really like that.
He's great. Like I think she was really well thought out. It honestly felt like he understood the dragons more than he understands horses, which is interesting because horses actually exist.
Or character development. But yeah, dragons are really cool. I mean, the magic system in this is sort of like whatever is useful in this particular scene.
Yeah. They do say that dragons have their own magic, and it's not well understood, and Saphira even says, like, when Aragon's like, "Well, how did you do that?" She's like, I don't know." And she says, like, I don't it just, like, kind of comes to me. So it feels more, like, instinctual than something that she's learning.
Yeah, I like it. I'm okay with dragons being creatures of magic
Yeah,
that don't make a lot of sense. I'm super cool with that, and I think that was a nice thing that they did here, even if
yeah.
it was just sort of like, we need the plot to do this.
Yeah, a place where it does diverge from Pern is so not all dragons bond riders, but also dragons live forever and grow for their entire life. If they bond a rider, the rider also lives forever with them. The dragon can die and the rider might not, but the dragon will die if the rider dies.
Seems like a rough deal for the dragons.
Yeah, like why would you bond a human if you could live forever without them? Like you have this like tiny
I don't think
fragile.
they get a choice. They like come out of the womb being like, well, not out of the womb. They
I guess
come
they could
in.
just be like, I'm never gonna hatch.
Yeah.
But
They're just cool, I think. We get a lot of dragon action in this book. We don't see her fight a lot. When she does, she kicks absolute ass and is super great.
like, cuts people in half with her jaws. Yeah. She is, like, kind of violent. She's like, "I'll kill them all." A lot, she says. She gets, like, a blood rage a little bit, which I think is fine.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she's most of the book where she's not in it, she's probably out like murdering animals. So
Yeah, it's funny that, like, Aragon's like, "I'm gonna steal all this meat from, Sloane before I leave, even though I have a dragon who can hunt all the meat I need." That boy eats so much meat and passes out so much.
yeah, is there anything else you want to say about the dragons?
I don't think so. Yeah, it would have been nice to see a second dragon. I know that there is a second dragon in Eldest. I did just want to mention because the cover art on this book is so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And it's actually the author named a place in the book, Palancar Valley, after the illustrator who illustrated this cover. And I it's unclear when I was reading this whether he just really liked that cover artist or that like just I don't know if he only does cover art. I'm assuming that he does other kind of fantasy art and stuff, that he just really liked his work and then named the valley after him and then he did the cover art for this book, or if he named it after him after he did the cover art for this book. But like obviously he had this huge amount of respect for this cover artist, and this artist has done a fantastic job with the beautiful dragons that he's created for all of his books.
Do you want to just talk about what it feels like revisiting a book from your childhood? Since that's sort of, I mean, this is
Oh,
sort of
sure.
one of the books that is the reason we're reading about dragons, right?
I think I mentioned this earlier. I thought I was going to have this nostalgic experience with this book where I was going to think that it was better than it is just because I had this love for it as a child. And I think that you kind of had that experience when we read Earthsea because you got kind of defensive over it in some parts where I was like, I didn't think this made sense. And you're like, I didn't care. It was fine. And I was like, well, no, it didn't make sense. And you're like, no, it's fine.
No, I just still like that book. 'Cause I didn't read it as a child. I read it as a 25-year-old.
It is a good book. But I thought I was going to be like that with this, where I thought I was going to be like, "Hey, no, don't say that about Brahm," Or like I really just thought I was going to like it better. And I was kind of disappointed in some ways because I was like, oh, this isn't nearly what I remember it being. Like I said earlier, after I read Eragon, I really started looking for books where the protagonist was a woman or a girl because I was a child. And I didn't in my memory, I was like, "Oh, it's just because I was a girl and I wanted to see myself represented in these books," because absolutely no women had any kind of real characterization in this book. But I think it was like because it was so aggressively not it was so like aggressively about like the chosen boy. But yeah, so that's the reason why I like started searching for books with female protagonists when I was a kid. And I found a few. I remember reading Dealing with Dragons. I don't remember the book at all. I remember reading Hatching Magic, and I remember absolutely loving Hatching Magic, which is a book that I feel like no one has heard about.
And we'll probably read eventually.
Yeah. Oh, did you want to talk about your experience revisiting this book, though?
It was very funny because it took me a year to read this book, and I didn't remember anything about it. And I remember reading it because everybody was talking about it, and it left almost no impression on me. And I didn't read any of the following books. And then this time I read it in a week, which is like much faster. And I think I understood why I kept putting it down.
I think it's one of those books that you can easily put down because it's so episodic in the way that it's written. Again, like you said earlier, this is a great book to read as a bedtime story to a kid. So if you have a kid who's like really into magic, you might want to read this to them. It's inoffensive in most ways. It's just like not a great work of fiction. It's just fine. It's a kid's book. That's what it is.
And it goes pretty quickly at the beginning.
Yeah, so this has been Eragon by Christopher Paolini. What are we reading next, JoJo?
So we have not had a good string of books that
No.
we've picked out. We are nicer than this podcast would let you to believe. We like a lot of books. I don't think we've done a good job of picking them, which is our bad.
Well, okay. Dragon Prince was almost a good book. It just had that horrifying scene in it that ruined the whole book.
Yeah, the back half, the pacing gets weird. But yeah,
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 it does.
yeah. What we've talked about it, and we like Naomi Novak. We're big fans of hers. We've read a couple of her other series. So we're gonna bank on a known author that we like to give us a book that we think would be fun and joyful, so we can have a fun and joyful podcast instead of one where we grump about plot. We are reading His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novak next week.
And this book is basically the Napoleonic Wars, but with dragons. It's kind of Master and Commander fanfic. I haven't read the book that the movie Master and Commander is based on, but Master and Commander is actually one of my partner's favorite movies, and it's it's like a really good movie. I love that movie. Hopefully, I'm hoping, I'm begging, I'm begging for a good book. But I've never heard a bad thing about this book from anyone who has read it. So we'll see.
Yeah, Naomi Novak is a really competent author, so I'm really curious to see how someone who has an understanding of how people work approaches naval strategy.
And who can also write women. Imagine that. I've heard that there's a really fun female character in this book also. All right, so that's all we have for today. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and hit the subscribe button.
Yeah, and let us know, what were your thoughts on Aragon? Did you also read it as a child? And then did you come back to it as an adult? Are you a child now, reading it for the first time? If so, what are your opinions on it? Would you recommend this book to others? Let us know in the comments, and let us know what other dragon books you'd like us to read.
Yeah, also, if you read it as a child and then came back to it as an adult, did your opinion change or did you still continue to love it? And again, just because we didn't continue to love it doesn't mean that you can't continue to love it. And I would love to hear that you did continue to love it and what your thoughts are concerning that. So please share those as well, because that would make me feel so much better. Anyway, that's all we have for today. Bye, everybody.
Bye.